Good morning and welcome to the 35th meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2025. Our first item of business this morning is a decision on taking items 4, 5 and 6 in private. Item 4 is consideration of the evidence on the draft climate change plan. Item 5 is the consideration of a draft pre-budget scrutiny letter to the Scottish Government. And item 6 is consideration of the work programme. Are we agreed to take these items in private? We are agreed. I would just like to say, I should have said at the beginning, that apologies have been received from Mark Ruskell, who's unable to attend today. Item 2 is the draft climate change plan. It's an evidence session on this, on the plan that was introduced on the 6th of November. Parliament's got 120 days to scrutinise the draft, and the Scottish Government have indicated they intend to lay a final plan before dissolution for the election in March next year. Put simply, the plan is a strategy document setting out how the Government intends to meet carbon reduction targets across all of the society and the economy. This committee is leading cross-committee scrutiny of the draft plan, and it's our first real evidence session on it. Today we're considering the report in the round and fundamentally asking what makes a good climate change plan, and does this look like a good climate change plan? Hopefully we'll find out the answers at the end of the day. And I'm going to welcome our panel of witnesses. We've got Dr. Richard Dixon, Chair, and Neil Langhorne, Head of Strategy and Analysis for the Environmental Standards Scotland, Professor Graham Roy, the Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and Claire Warmby, the Co-Director of Scottish Climate Intelligence Service. Thank you all for attending this meeting. I'll get the thanks in at the beginning in case you're not so thankful to have attended at the end, but hopefully you will be. And I get the first question, and it's going to be to each of you. Probably Richard and Neil, you might have to decide between you which one answers this. So I'm going to come to you, Claire, just to give you warning in advance. So what are your overall views on the draft climate change plan, and how does it compare to earlier versions? Is it what you expected?
I presume that when we're talking about the draft plan, we're talking about the plan plus its various annexes.
Yes.
So, in terms of was it what we expected? Yes, probably. Was it what we hoped for? Some of what we hoped for. So, I think, obviously, in terms, this is a massively complex area. It cuts across all sorts of facets of government, and you can tell that it's been really difficult to pull it together in a way that kind of makes both sense, has sufficient detail, but is also communicable to people. So I think, I think you can see that there's a huge amount of work has gone into trying to make this that document. In terms of what we were hoping it to be, I guess what we really wanted was more laid out clarity about the who, what, where, how and when of all of these policy deliveries, because I think, and this is kind of cuts the very kind of chase of this, we call it both a strategy and a plan and policies and proposals, but in reality a plan is something that tells you what to do, when, how to sequence it, and possibly talks about the kind of risks and the costs of those activities. So I think in that sense, it's possibly trying to be all things to all men, maybe a bit more plan in there. I think there's huge uncertainties, and I think it's not a bad thing to have the uncertainties laid out, because I think they're there, but I think we need to be honest about them.
I'm trying to decipher that. I mean, it's a very nice way of saying that it's not got half the stuff in it that you thought was going to be in it. Is that a fair assumption? Try to put it in a sentence.
Yes, we wanted more detail about the delivery.
Okay, Graham, thank you, Claire. Sorry to put words into your mouth, but it helps me. Graham.
Great. Thanks, Convener. So our particular interest is in the fiscal dimensions of this, so the fiscal sustainability implications of this. And prior to the plan coming out, we set out in our most recent fiscal sustainability report, we looked at climate change, what do we need to see in it? And that was really around the detail behind it, which Claire's picked on some of it around the methods, about how any numbers have been calculated. And I guess crucially for us from a fiscal perspective is what are the uncertainties or what are the potential variabilities in that, in order to let essentially government plan over the medium to long term. And I think in all of that, I think from our perspective, there's some really useful material in there, but does it let us have a detailed plan about long-term fiscal sustainability? Then that detail isn't there. And that's not to be a criticism per se, but it's just to say that actually if you were to look at this from a fiscal sustainability perspective, then the information that we would need in order to make that judgment call isn't in the document.
Isn't?
Isn't.
Okay. Now, Richard and Neil, I don't know who's going to throw the other one under the bus. Oh, Neil, you've thrown Richard under the bus.
Thank you. I'll start off. Neil would be able to go through in detail, if you would like that, how it matches up to the things we said in our letter about what a good plan looks like. But I'll start with an overview and we can see if you want to give us time for that. So the first thing to say, like Claire, is that there are some good things about this. So there are strong statements about the urgency of tackling climate change, of the economic benefits that flow from that, of the need for an organised, just transition, and about our international obligations on climate change. It's also good because it follows the recommended budgets from the Committee on Climate Change, and it mostly follows their recommendations about pathways. In the 320-something pages, clearly there's been a lot of effort to try and do better than the CCPU in terms of that level of detail. But as Claire says, it's still missing the who, what, when. So you can't quite disentangle that detail. And the frustration is that there are overall numbers for packages which suggest that for individual policies a number has been developed and it's been added up to the number you're presented with for the whole package of 6 policies, but you're not being shown the individual numbers or timescales or costs. So that's a frustration that actually the information must be there. We're not being given that level. It's also good because there are some high-level cost and benefit estimates in there which are really helpful. And so it's clearly showing us that investment today will save us money in the future because climate change is coming and we need to both adapt and change our economy. And that's heading off a £17 billion loss of GDP in 2040, according to the study that's quoted in there. But, of course, there's less cost information for individual policies. But overall, those figures suggest to you that climate change is the ultimate case for preventative spend. We must spend today to get ourselves in shape for the future, otherwise we face a very large bill in the future. But I wanted to touch on one of the things that we said in our letter in March. So one of the things we said right up front was, it is imperative that there is sufficient time for scrutiny of the next draft CCP and incorporation of feedback before its finalisation. And I know that the committee was very concerned about that issue as well, of how much time will there be. And we don't seem to have learnt the lesson from last time. So in 2021, the CCPU came before the Parliament. 4 committees worked hard on making recommendations, 166 recommendations. I thought that was a great example of Parliament doing proper scrutiny on a piece of strategy. And yet, because there was only about 20 days between the end of scrutiny and the election, the government published the final version as the same as the draft. And so it basically ignored all 166 recommendations. It wrote a letter saying, well, we thought about them, and it said they will be taken into account in the next CCP. And yet there is no mention. So maybe lots of them have, but there is no mention in this CCP that any recommendations from the past committees have been taken into account. So we have the same situation. We have about 20 days between the end of parliamentary scrutiny and Parliament going on recess and then being dissolved for the election. And the government has said it will produce the final version by the end of those 20 days. So there is very little time for them to read what you have said and actually do something about it meaningfully. So that's frustrating. And so what can they do about that? Well, it's a difficult situation we're in, which we can't entirely fix, but I would hope the Scottish Government is reading all of the submissions as they come in. They're watching sessions like these at committees, and they are revising as they go. So they're not waiting for you to produce the ultimate answer to what should happen. They are preempting some of that and producing the next draft, so that at least when they produce the final draft or a final version before the election, they have incorporated a lot of what people have been saying. So I hope we can do that, but that will still mean there is a need for the committee, as the predecessor committee did, to write a stiff letter to its successor saying this was an important piece of work and our recommendations perhaps haven't been fully dealt with. It is really important that you and the whole Parliament consider scrutiny of the implementation of the climate change plan as a really key issue for the next session.
So can I just stop you there and just clarify, because I think it's important that I think the issues you've raised are pretty fundamental to the situation that we find ourselves in. So the committee has met with other committee conveners and asked them to undertake work, which the three of the committees are going to undertake specific bits of work to support the work that we're doing. The issue is, of course, as you said, Richard, we've got limited time to do that, and the committee or the Parliament has to have finished its consultation by the 5th of March, which means that the consultation that the government's undertaking, and I suspect will only release the summary of the responses will by early February. We will already be considering our report before we've probably seen the summary of responses. And I, on behalf of the committee, have made my concerns clear, and I want to make them clear again, that when we have to report, which is the 5th of March, we have, unless I've got my maths entirely wrong, which is quite possible considering my inability to do maths properly, or as my mother would say, is that we've got about 9 sitting days from the end of, once we submit our consultation, to consider the draft plan, which will have been amended to the real plan and the final plan. And we are exactly where you said we were going to be, which to me is of huge concern, and I'm sure scrutiny will suffer because of the tight timescale. So, Richard, sorry, I wanted to just flesh that out so you understood that there was other work being done by other committees, and we still remain concerned. Sorry, yes. I stopped you in the middle. Or had you come to a logical end?
That's kind of the logical end of that section, but thank you very much for that. If you will indulge us, Neil could do a bit more on what does good look like in our letter and how does the current plan match up.
Yep, Neil.
Sure, so thanks, Richard. So, as Richard said, we did look at the previous climate change plan. We had a representation about that, and so we published a report on that representation, setting out what we thought needed to be addressed in the next plan, and that very much informed our letter to you back in March about what would make a good climate change plan. So, in that, we set out that we wanted to see quantified emissions reductions for individual proposals and policies. That's been partly met in that some policies there is that level of detail, but for most of them it's at the kind of package of policies level, which is actually what's required by the Act, but it would have been good to have seen that greater level of detail. We wanted to see clear timelines for all the proposals and policies, and I don't think we've got that. There is there for some of them, but certainly not for all of them. Richard's already mentioned the point about the time to consider the draft. Another point, and I think these two come together, was we wanted to see clarity around effective monitoring and delivery of the plan. I think that's been partly met in that the monitoring and evaluation annex does set out quite a lot of detail, and one of the ideas to have early warning indicators is a good one in principle, but I'm not sure the detail is there. We also wanted to see clear ownership and responsibility for individual proposals and policies, and I think some of that is lacking as well, and that builds on Claire's point from earlier about knowing how this is going to be delivered and by who and by when. In terms of meeting the requirements of the 2019 Act, we think that's, again, partly been met, so the just transition principles have been embedded, and the monitoring framework does include just transition indicators as well as emissions, but adaptation monitoring remains separate at the moment, so that's something that's not yet been integrated. And the final point we made was about addressing the unresolved recommendations from previous parliamentary committees, which Richard's already mentioned.
Okay, I was going to drill down into further questions on what had and hadn't been met, but you've all been pretty clear to me, which means that we can go straight to the next questions, which I believe are coming from Douglas. And over to you, Douglas.
Thank you, Convener. I'm staying on the costs and benefits that we've spoke about already. So as we mentioned, in the draft plan, costs and benefits are set out at a sectoral level. What are your views on how the costs and benefits have been quantified and presented? Is there enough detail in the plan to actually analyse what these costs are? Maybe come to you first, Claire.
I think I haven't found a kind of like an easy read guide to what is included in the assumptions of the costs and the benefits. And my feeling is that at different times, different benefits are being included. Some of them, financial, some of them non-financial. So I think probably still a little bit of clarity about the kind of the detail on that. Having said that, in many ways, it's kind of, I don't think that breaking it down to an absolutely granular level of a cost and benefit for every single policy is possible. Our experience of working with local authorities is that sometimes when we're talking about a package of measures trying to achieve an overall aim in complex systems, it's quite difficult to disentangle. So, an overall approach to a package of policies is fine. What we really need to know is kind of what goes into, what's the numbers made up from, what goes into that, what assumptions are we making, what are the risks of those assumptions? And, it's, I guess, a kind of who gets the benefits is also important, because in some cases, it's kind of the benefits might be experienced by a fairly small sliver of society, and that goes back to the just transition point. So I don't need it to be broken down in detail. What I'd like is a bit more detail about how those numbers come up.
Okay, thank you. And Graham, can I come to you? Was the Scottish Fiscal Commission, were they involved in any of this, putting this sort of numbers on the face of this plan, or?
Yeah, no. So that's outside our remit. So this would be numbers the government would pull together. I think from a fiscal perspective, the detail that is needed is essentially what's the investment, what's the expenditure that will go on the elements within the plan throughout the life cycle of the plan. So we have, for example, a budget spending review coming up in the new year. So how do the specific scenarios, costs, benefits, assumptions that are put into this document relate to actually what the government will do in its budget and its spending plans for the next 5 years? And I think that's where the detail is needed, and that's one of the key points that we make from a fiscal point of view and a budget point of view is how do the numbers and the analysis underpinning this document speak to what we'll see in budget documents about where action will actually take place, and then vice versa. So how, when we see the budget document, can we see actually the money is being spent in exactly the places that will deliver this plan? And that's a level of detail we don't have yet.
So do you think there will be a linkage between the budget that we'll see in the next couple of months and this document, or is this, because it's still in draft stage, then there will be no actual linkage at this time?
I mean, I think that's a key question. I mean, I think that's a key element of, if this is a plan that is to be delivered, then it needs to be backed up with a budget that delivers that plan. So I think the budget and spending review will be a key element. And then equally, when the plan is then finalised, it's then how does that speak back to the budget documents?
But I guess if there's a lack of detail in this document on the financials, then it'll be difficult to link the budget back to some of these actions that will need to be taken.
Well, you would think that there'd be some analysis and some scenarios about what's gone into the actual activity to underpin this. So, for example, the figures around net cost, for example, the net costs and relative benefits, they will be underpinned by policies. I guess the question that isn't in there is what are these policies that are, as Claire said, policies for the broader economy that might then be picked up by the private sector, changes in behaviour, but what are the specific policies that will cost money, and when are they taking place and at what points?
So I guess it's maybe a question we'll have for government. Do they have that detail, do you think, or because they must have some ideas on cost, because we're obviously given sort of headline figures. So the working must be there. And I guess it's just trying to get that working from the Scottish Government.
Yeah, and I think there's two elements to it. There's one is what's the underlying detail that is underpinning the plan, and that is over the medium to long term. I think for any plan to be effective, it then has to speak to the here and now, and the proof of that will be in the budget documents and the spending review, where the government will set out exactly what they plan to do over the next year, the next 5 years. And the key element, I think, will then be is how then that speaks to the plan, and is it actually going to deliver the plan?
Okay, thank you. Richard, can I ask you as well, do you think there's enough detail in the financials within the climate change plan as it is just now?
So no, I think, as I said before, there's a good level of very high-level detail, which shows overall that we should invest today to save in the future, and that if we don't, we're in trouble. So that's very helpful to see. But then at the level of actual action, we're missing that bottom level of what each policy is going to cost. So if I might give an example, I always think it's useful to illustrate these things with examples. So in Appendix 3, it talks about Package 2, which is measures to encourage modal shift. It has a key policy, which is about car use reduction, and then it has 6 supporting policies. And so some of them are about concessionary travel, so we should know how much that costs. Some of them are about investment in active and sustainable travel programmes, but there's no indication of how much we're investing in that and what the payback might be. So for those 6 policies, there is then a summary of what the total benefits are and what the net costs are. And the benefits are stated to quite a level of accuracy. So in the first budget period, supposedly £3,670,000 will be the total benefits. And so that's to the nearest £1,000 they have quoted a figure. And there is some narrative afterwards which explains where the biggest part of the costs come from and where the biggest part of the benefits come from, although the benefits are a bit intangible to actually try and understand. But what we haven't got is for those 6 policies, an actual statement, this will cost this in this budget period and this in the next budget period, and the benefits we expect are these. And yet to produce those quite accurate, or at least apparently accurate, summary figures in Table 21, they must have had those numbers to add up. So there's a kind of Annex 5 which is missing, which is all of that detail. And the same with the CO2 reductions from each of those policies. It's added up into a package number, which is what the Act says they should do. But what everyone else wants is to see what is each of these policies going to do. So, as I say, there's been a lot of work. The top level figures are very interesting, but we're still missing that bottom level of, for each policy, what's it cost? What are the benefits and where are they coming from? As Claire said, how are they calculated? Because some of them are expected wider economic benefits because there's less congestion, for instance. And some of them are people have more money in their pocket because they've got free bus travel. So they're quite different things to compare, and yet they're being added up together. And it'd be good to understand all of them.
And do you think there would be any downsides for the government for actually publishing that data?
I think there is potentially a fear that some of these numbers are really quite uncertain. But certainly in 2040, if we're proposing a policy that's active in 2040, everyone understands that anything you'll say about it will be quite vague because things will have changed a great deal. So I think they have perhaps urged on the side of not exposing some numbers that are quite vague so that they don't criticise for having vague figures, when any mature observer should say, well, of course, some of them are going to be vague and some of the benefits might be a little intangible. But at least you've put a number on it. That's good. So I think if that's their motivation, then I think probably that's a mistake and they should just put those figures out there so that we can see them. And it also means the key thing about that is it shows us where the uncertainties are. So at the moment, you've got 6 policies. They add up to this much CO2 reduction. They're going to cost that much and give this much benefit. But you don't know which ones are the most approximate, which ones might go wrong, which ones have the greatest potential for failure. And so seeing the numbers and how they've been calculated would let you say, well, that's great, 5 of those look really rock solid, but that I understand now that that one could go wrong. And I'd like to know what the government's going to do if it does go wrong, because contingency is something that's not spelled out in much of this. So I think it would be really useful for Parliament, but also for the general public, to be able to see that level, that next level of detail. It's like the Scottish budget. Yeah. You want to go right down to the bottom level and understand the detail so that you can then see what the risks are, where the big hitters are. Is there something you can do to make a policy which doesn't produce much reduction actually do a bit more, etc.
And I guess there you would be able to, or we'd be able to see as well, where you get the biggest bang for your buck almost.
Yes.
But of course, we're not really seeing that at present.
That's right.
Neil, is there anything you'd like to add on the costs and how transparent it is? Or?
I think the only thing I would add, and this is obviously much more Fiscal Commission's territory, but I think what we are concerned is that it's not clear how much elements of the plan will cost different delivery bodies, so whether that's Scottish Government, local authorities, private and public expectations. So I think there's that level of detail needs to come through.
And I guess that would be needed quite soon as well, as local authorities start making their budgets also. Maybe I'll come to that point with you, Graham.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it comes back, I guess, to the point about how does a plan, which is long-term and strategic, fit with the day-to-day operations of government at all different tiers. So how does this feed through to the budget at the Scottish Government level, which then feeds through to local authorities or delivery bodies? And again, it's that ability to trace through the actions and ambitions through to actually how do you see activity taking place that is going to actually then deliver the plan.
Mm-hmm. So I guess as local authorities are making their budgets, it's going to be difficult for them because they won't actually see what they're meant to be doing and what it's going to cost them in their budgets as they're setting them for next year.
Yeah, well, I think there's two parts to that, isn't there? There's how much flows into local government, and then how much of that is then directive or supportive of local governments to take the decisions there. So the real coordination issue as well, which I guess underpins the actual reality of how you deliver this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Camino.
Just before we leave costs, it struck me that we had some gross costs put in there which were netted out to benefits. And it was so high level, as I think you suggested, Richard, that it's impossible to see where the risks are. At what level, and it's impossible to take people with the government when it comes to buying into investing in climate change. So my question on that is that an accurate statement, and are you fearful that if people don't know what the real costs of adapting to climate change are, they won't buy into the plan? Do you think it will fall on that basis? Graham, do you want to go with that?
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't make a comment about where it will fall or fail on that basis, but I do think there is a real challenge there between, comparing net costs, which account for assessments of different types of benefits and how meaningful they are, and actually then the practicalities with what does it mean for budget lines and what does it mean for expenditures of different tiers of government or whether that be different agencies. So again, if you look at like the net cost that is in the plan, if I think is around about 4.8 billion or something like that. If you look at the number that we talk about purely in mitigation, in terms of expenditure, on our analysis, it's about 21 billion. And it's quite clear that what we're doing is something different over time, but we're looking at what is the kind of expenditures, the net costs that public investment will be needed by the devolved public sector in order to deliver that. And I would argue it's the actual expenditure that is where you have to make the opportunity costs about spending more in one area, less in another area. This is actually what it will look like in terms of budget lines within local authorities or within national government. And that will require investment and it will require difficult choices about what you prioritise. So there's something about the difference between gross and net being an academic conversation, but actually the reality is that it's the gross expenditure that is the one that will hit the budget lines.
I mean, my problem is I can't understand what's been netted off to actually see where the benefits are. So if, for example, you looked at heating buildings and you went on an EPC system, not that I think that's a worthwhile system, I think it should be reviewed, and I think the government are reviewing it, is it gives you a bottom line cost for making the changes to reach EPCC, which could be, for example, in a house, and I've used this example before, if you're D or E, could be up to £40,000 worth of cost. And the net benefit is £323 saving in electricity per year. That allows people to see what the costs are to them. Would you not think that, and I'm going to come to you, Claire, that actually laying it out a bit more would encourage people to invest where they think they can make reasonable change and prioritise that investment without just saying, oh, well, there's a saving to you somewhere, we can't tell you what it actually is?
I'm not totally sure that, it's kind of like we need everybody to buy into the plan. Humans, I don't think humans kind of look at a plan that comes out of government and think, right, okay, this is the one, this is it, this is what I need to do. In actual fact, humans are operating in this environment of incentives and disincentives and clear regulations and clear signals from government. So, I mean, fundamentally, the question you're asking is, is the steer from government in this plan really clear about what you want to do, what people to do and what you want them to invest in? Do they feel comfortable that the investments that they make will bring them the returns that they're kind of promised, or that that they will be penalised if they don't make those investments over time as the system shifts? So it's kind of like the plan is not something that people buy into. What they buy into is a kind of like what works for me in my household, for my lifestyle, for my decision making, and do I know what the government want to happen? Are they really, really clear about this?
And are they? You asked the question to yourself, let me throw it back at you. Are they really clear? I mean, in fairness, Claire, I would say that if I'm asked to sign up to a plan, and I've been asked to do it in various different guises in my life, if I don't sign up to it, I'm not bought into it, I'm not going to commit to it. So you've asked the question, are you signed up to what's in this plan?
I am...
Well, maybe that says everything in itself.
I don't know exactly. So discarding the point of view of me as an individual in society, if I'm a local government, which is kind of roughly what we do, am I signed up to a plan? I don't know what I'm signing up for.
Okay, so you can't sign up to something you're not signed up for. You should never do that, should you?
Yeah, I think it's until I know what I'm supposed to do and what I'm supposed to spend to get this to work, then, yeah, I think it's going to be difficult for people to sign up to it. But, you know, this is a plan that goes through Parliament. People aren't signing up to it. The government and Parliament are signing up to it.
No, people are signing up to it because their elected representatives will make a decision and speak to it. It doesn't have to pass. We have to discuss it, but people have to sign up to it. If you don't sign up to it, did we not learn that from the latest COP debates, where if people aren't signed up to it, then it's not going to be achieved?
I think in that case, I would say that it would be worth having a much stronger narrative about households and saying this is the incentives and the disincentives and the regulatory framework that we are laying out in this plan, and this is what it could mean for you.
Okay.
But that will be different for a household that has a car and a household that doesn't have a car, a household in a rural area, a household who is heavily integrated into different industries. It's kind of like you can't make one size fits all. Okay,
so Graham, you heard Claire's question. You signed up to it? Can you sign up to it?
Yeah, so just to be really clear, so the Fiscal Commission wouldn't take a view, it doesn't take a view on any plan, any policy for government, and we don't advocate or disagree with anything the government would put forward. Our role is essentially to put out whatever the plan is, what's the level of information that's available that then underpins fiscal sustainability or the budget.
Okay, I understand that, and it's a pity that Audit Scotland aren't here to talk to the figures, but they declined the invitation to come today's meeting for a variety of reasons. Richard, are the public going to sign up to this plan?
I think that's a good question. So from ESS's perspective, our job is to make sure that environmental law works. So we look at it, the draft plan, from the perspective of is it delivering what's required by law? And the answer is broadly yes. So there are lots of details that could be better. There's lots of detail that isn't there. There are some policies that individuals might disagree with. But overall, it is aiming to meet the budgets given to us by CCC, and it has numbers in it which appear to add up to meeting those targets. So at the very top level, it is a plan aiming for the right things and presents a set of policies, albeit without all the detail you'd want, which gets there. So in that sense, we would say, yes, this is I'm not going to say a good plan because we have a set of criteria for a good plan, but it's definitely on the way. But there's a lot of work to do, either before it's finished to make a better final version, or afterwards in the implementation to do exactly what's been called for instance, by Claire, which is for every public body, particularly the local authorities, to understand what does it mean they should be putting in their budget this coming year, what does it mean in 20 years' time for them. So there's that level of detail that needs to come. And in terms of the numbers, so I agree that more explanation of how the numbers are derived would help people understand, question where they want to question, but potentially buy in to those numbers. And just to give an example, if the government spends money on grant schemes and loan schemes for insulating people's homes and changing their heating systems to low or zero carbon, that's quite a large bill. That's in the billions, many billions, to do what we need to do there. But what does it do for people? Well, it makes their homes healthier places to be. So the evidence shows that people take less days off sick, so industry benefits, businesses benefit, public sector employees benefit their employer. It shows that people go to see the doctor less, so the NHS bill, a public bill, decreases, but it's hard to quantify that. It shows that children perform better at school because they live in a house which is warm enough for them to actually go into the bedroom and do their homework rather than sit shivering in the sitting room with everyone else. And if households save money on their heating bills, they, in general, don't buy themselves a holiday in Torremolinos. They spend more in the local economy. So the local economy is boosted because the government has invested in making people's homes more efficient. So those are the kind of benefits you want to add up, but each one of them is quite different. Each one of them is really hard to quantify. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a go, and you should explain what you've done. And people say, well, that's not realistic, it's only going to be half of that. But at least you've put it out there for people to see. So I agree more detail would be very useful. But overall, should we sign up to this plan? Well, we should keep carping on about what more we want and what we want during the implementation phase. But overall, yes, this is a plan which gets us to the right place, and so we should support it.
Okay. I'm not sure I agree with you, but Kevin wants to come in, so I'll bring him in.
I do, Convener, and I want to come back to Ms Warmby, because earlier on in the session you said granular, in a paraphrase, granular cost and benefits assessments are almost impossible. And yet, just a few minutes ago, you wanted that cost and benefit assessment for every single household, taking into account whether they have a car or not. What is it? Are granular cost and benefit assessments impossible or possible, in your opinion? So,
when you have a group of policies all trying to deliver essentially the same outcome, so, a good example of this is in walking and cycling. We can do things like build cycle lanes, we can build bike parking, we can disincentivize car use. We can do an array of different interventions to get people to walk and cycle. It's actually quite difficult to disaggregate in a location or even across Scotland what the benefit of all of those individual actions are going to be. It's kind of like in the round, we hope that they get people to walk and cycle. If you want to reverse it and go, if people walk and cycle more, what are the distribution of costs and benefits to households? That's actually a surprisingly easier question in many ways, because we can say, right, okay, and again, it's kind of, we can't say every household would experience this, but we might be able to say that, on average, a household in a rural area would receive these kinds of benefits. Now, the benefits for walking and cycling tend to be distributed, they're around, the majority of benefits come from people's health improvements. So it really depends on, kind of how much you can get people to walk and cycle. So there are models that you can kind of do the reverse in. What's really difficult is to kind of, to take the groups of things that you do and go, individually, these things, is it bike parking that works? Is it cycle lanes that work? That's a complex system.
So, using Dr. Dixon's point earlier, where some of these things can be vague, I think was the word that you used. All of this is a bit vague, is it? And that's one of the reasons why I think you said earlier that granular cost and benefits assessments are almost impossible.
I think it's incredibly difficult to do that on policies. I think it's not so difficult to do that on outcomes. And I think on outcomes you can kind of work out a sort of, for a typical household, this is what would happen. But it won't be, it will be averaged. It will be kind of, you know, what is a typical household? So yes, you can do it one way, you can't necessarily do it the other way.
So,
I don't think that we need to kind of get down to the, do we need to, you know, is every single policy costed? What I think we need to know is exactly what Richard said, which is, what are the assumptions behind the costs going into this? Are we comfortable with them?
so again, I come back because Dr Dixon said earlier, you know, you can feel free to come in as well, Dr Dixon, you know, that a lot of the assumptions that could be made and may have been made, you know, folk will think, well, that's not right. And again, you know, the arguments galore will come into play if you get as granular as some folk want us to be. Is that fair?
I suspect that there are going to be arguments galore anyway, so we could have arguments around the assumptions and the numbers. If you know, they're there, it's, you know, if you put out a number, you base the number on something. So we could have a discussion about what that was based on, or we could have a discussion where we don't know what it's based on. I don't know. I mean, it's...
Okay. Dr Dixon, I mentioned you, so do you want to come in?
Yes. So I think that it is correct that if you expose your assumptions in full, that opens you up to people challenging you. But it's much better to have that transparency so that people can see that, by and large, you have honestly tried to estimate some difficult things. And if you've really got it wrong, they can tell you that. But it's much better for people to be able to see that you have made an honest attempt to understand what the reduction in health costs to the NHS might be from reducing fuel poverty, than just have a black box which says the number is 423, without telling you why the number is 423.
How granular should all of this be?
I think the example I quoted had very accurate numbers, so down to the nearest £1,000, and it had some narrative which explained what the big numbers were in terms of costs and benefits. So we're kind of halfway there. But for the 6 policies, there's very little detail for the other 5 that aren't included in the narrative. So to include some detail for each of those, to say here are the assumptions which produce this number. So I think that's at the level of individual policies, that's maximum transparency. It's something the government has already done because they've been able to add those numbers up. But they're not showing us. And if they did show us, we might find that for 1 or 2 of them, they would say, well, we haven't been able to produce a number for this. And it would be useful to understand that. And for others, we might say, well, that's great, let's do more of that policy, because that one looks really cost-effective.
You gave the example of concessionary fares.
Yes.
And if government came up with an assumption of how much that policy is going to cost in 2040, you know, I imagine that there will be arguments galore around about what that true number of costs would be.
Well, you're right.
And there are all kinds of things that would come into play. What is the bus fleet at that particular point in time? What investment has been made? Has it been completely and utterly decarbonised? And the list goes on. So no matter what figure government came up with there would be an argument from almost everyone that that would be wrong. Is that not the case?
I think the only thing that is true about predictions of the future is that they're bound to be wrong. But that's not an excuse to try and make predictions, to do your best effort to make the right prediction, or the best prediction you can, and to explain how you've done that. And that's the bit that we're missing, is the explaining how you've done that.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
I think it goes back to what I was always told at school: show your workings, and then you might get some marks for that. Right, Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Convener. I did have a supplementary. Mr. Stewart has interrogated quite well a lot of the questions I wanted to ask, but Mr. Stewart, I think, in part quoted Dr. Dixon about the numbers being understandably vague. I think he said, Dr. Dixon, but he prefaced that with any mature observer would surely realise the numbers would be understandably vague. Is one of the issues government has, be that the Scottish Government, the UK Government or others, is a lot of observers are not mature and they might want to willfully mislead the situation with regards net zero. And I'm just wondering, Dr Dixon, if you think there's been a nervousness from government that if they're predicting out to 2040 and something that is clearly not an exact science whatsoever, the numbers will invariably eventually proven to be wrong because life gets in the way of modelling work and therefore they're not showing their work, as the Convener would say. So do you understand the reticence of government? How would you respond to that? And I suppose, how do we make sure there's a kind of cross-party, cross-government view that we call out those who are not mature observers?
I think that's a really interesting question. So when I said understandably vague, I was talking about numbers in 2040, because it's such a long time away that you will get it wrong, because lots of things will have changed. I think if you were to look at what was suggested in the CCPU 5 years ago and the annual monitoring that shows what's happened, you will see that, of course, some things have gone well, some things have gone off track, some things haven't happened at all. And so the reality is that when you produce a plan, as soon as you've published it, things start to diverge from where you were. And the key trick is to have the right governance systems so that when one policy is underperforming, you make up for that somewhere else, or you correct that. And so that's the reality of the past, is that when you put out a plan and then you start to monitor it, you will see that things go off track and suddenly something actually, rooftop solar suddenly does better than you expected. That's great. So things change. And I think the same is true of predicting the future, that you will predict a pathway, but you will then very soon diverge from that. And so, again, the mature observer, and I include in that Parliament, when it scrutinises progress every year, Parliament is really important so that CCC will say to us, this year, this policy is going off track and that policy is doing really well and there's a gap here in transport. And so you will get that well-informed commentary from them about the progress of policies, but it's the responsibility of Parliament to interpret that for the public, to say, well, this is the analysis and we think the government has got a grip on this and is making up for the deficiencies, or we think there's a serious problem here and call the Minister, Cabinet Secretary to account for getting back on track. So Parliament has a big responsibility in, I would like to think that the whole of Scotland thinks that the Parliament is a bunch of informed observers. Sadly, some people don't think that, but many people do think that when the Parliament says something about what the government's up to, that that's worth listening to. So you are an important part of that, making sure that the public cannot have a reactionary view because one policy has gone off track. They have an informed view that that policy has gone off track, but this one's been accelerated, so the overall change is going to be where we want it to be and we're on track on the trajectory. Okay. So there's an important job for Parliament in that. There's a job for bodies like us, very important job obviously for the Committee on Climate Change because they are the independent scientific advisors, but a job for the responsible bits of the media as well when these things come out to say this is what's gone well, but this is where we should focus because this hasn't gone so well.
Okay, now let me just follow up on that, Dr Dixon, and if Claire or Professor Roy wants to come in with any reflections, please do. Then I'll go to my second question after this Convener. And I suppose it's about, sometimes it is about whether governments get it right or wrong, or it's about what modelling work they use to predict what will happen. So there'll be a lot of modelling work in relation to behavioural. We heard about behavioural change earlier, how households and individuals will buy in, or behavioural change. I think Claire Warrenby spoke about incentives and disincentives and how you can trigger some of that behavioural change rather than buying into this overall plan necessarily. So we want businesses to change how they do their business. We want sectors to change how they do their business. And it'll impact on every aspect of life. Now, none of this is an exact science. It's all based in modelling work. By definition, modelling works are best guesstimates of what will happen if you put different inputs into your policies. So no model will ever get it perfect. So I suppose what I'm saying, it's not about whether governments are right or wrong, it's whether they're using the best and most appropriate set of modelling assumptions to get to those estimates that maybe they haven't shown their working, Convener. So any thoughts about just changing the narrative on that, Dr Dixon? Because none of this is exact. It's all about modelling work. Should the government show a bit more about how they do their working and be very open and straightforward about, by definition, models are not an exact science?
Yes, I think so. I think that's the mature thing to do. I think I've said maximum transparency is the thing to do, and you expose yourself to people criticising you, but if people look at it and say, well, I may not quite agree with that, but that's quite reasonable to have assumed that, then that's helpful. But also, it lets anybody, whether they're a public body trying to deliver something, or they're a member of the public, or they're a parliamentarian, it lets them see, actually, that assumption is completely ridiculous, or that assumption is very brave. So it might happen, but it might not. And if it doesn't, what will we then do? So the uptake of EVs, the trajectory currently is very steeply upwards. The predictions are it will continue to be very steeply upwards. But if suddenly there's a huge tariff on Chinese electric cars, or China has a big spat with the EU and decides not to export electric cars for 10 years, then we're in quite some trouble. So what's the contingency plan then? So for the big hitters particularly, let's see all the assumptions so that you can spot where the weaknesses might be and ask what the contingency plans are. So another one is net emissions technology. That's got to work in a big way by 2040 to make the numbers add up. And there are plenty of people who are sceptical that that will ever happen, let alone at the scale that's proposed. So again, and the committees asked this 5 years ago, what is plan B if NETS doesn't work at the scale that you say it will? And in this plan, there is no plan B for that. So, but exposing all of your assumptions lets people see which ones they think might be risky and which ones look pretty rock solid. So I think I agree with you that we should see that working so that we can make those assessments.
Okay, that's helpful. Before we move on to my set questions, does Claire or Graham want to come in? You don't need to, but do you want to reflect on any of that before I move on?
I'll make a general point, if I may, and I think without getting really deeply philosophical about modelling about all of this, I think the point you're making is a really important point, not just for policy within climate change, but if you look at all the big issues government are trying to achieve, whether it be economic growth, coping with an ageing population, child poverty, long-term challenges, there is always a risk when you say the model says the answer is X, and it builds in a level of spurious accuracy and certainty that actually becomes quite challenging. And I think for me, a lot of it is about using modelling to be able to make a general direction of travel about where policy might go, and then being very clear about where you have real confidence and more certainty, particularly in the short term, coming back to the point about budgets, the upcoming budget. There you can be really quite clear about costs, when expenditure takes place and what needs to happen. But then it starts to get more uncertain as you move over the longer term. But it's not the point that you should just ignore that. The point is, you say, well, look, if you have these certain assumptions, if these things happen, these are the potential costs, the potential benefits that come down the line. So I think there's a carefulness between trying to use modelling as an excuse to come up with an exact science versus then taking the opposite view, which is, well, because the future is uncertain, because it's so far away, well, we just can't do anything. And I think there's a real careful maturity about unpicking the different elements of that to come up with a proper plan that deals with the short term and deals with the risks around the long terms.
Okay. You want to ask? I'd love to come in on this particular point, but after you've finished on your bit.
I finished that. I wanted to give Claire, you may not wish to come on the opportunity just to respond to some of it. Can you know that's all?
I mean, I suppose obviously it's kind of like we write a plan until 2040 because the legislation asks us to. In reality, find me an organisation that is operating on a plan that they wrote 20 years ago. There isn't one. So we all know that, and we know as well that we're going to rewrite this plan in 5 years' time. So the bit that we need certainty about is the short term. It's like what we need to do is we need to know who's doing what, when, how, now. In the future, these things are uncertain because uncertainty increases as your time horizon goes out, in which case we could be really honest and go, do you know what, our costs and benefits sit within a kind of range when we get out to climate budget period 3, but in climate budget period 1, this is what we need to make happen in order for 3 to happen. So in a way, it's kind of, we could be really a bit more upfront and honest about the fact that, yes, uncertainty increases as we go forward because it does, but actually, it's kind of the here and now, the first 5 year, what do we need to achieve in the first 5 years to make other things happen? That's where we need a bit more certainty.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, on that, I mean, I accept the plan will change. Carbon budgets won't change because we set the carbon budgets up till 2045. That was the whole point of it and gave us a trajectory. So, am I right in saying what you're asking for is more detailed in the short term with a variance figure, plus or minus, which would give us an indication of what we need to do to get back on track? Surely that would be a properly worked out plan. Would it not be worked on that? You know, if you fail in this, you might need to do more here or there. So most budgets have plus or minuses.
Well, I mean, the plan is essentially, and as far as I know, the legislation is also slightly uncertain about what happens if we exceed or we don't meet them, the budgets. The
legislation is, well, I think it's agreed that if you exceed and you think you can't then write that off against
you can't
the future,
bank
you can't bank it and move on.
So,
that's my understanding.
So, yeah, I mean, essentially what you need to do is kind of be going, if there's, I don't know how many policies there are in there because I haven't counted them all, but I think there's about 120 policies. Have we got, I guess the question is, do we have more policies than we need, assuming that some are not going to play out how we think they will? Or is that, have we got to hit it and hit it precisely, and we've just got enough carbon in those if everything works out? Because if everything in that plan has to go as planned, that's a massive risk in there. So how much contingency is there in the first 5 years? You know, how many policies could fall off the rails?
It's very difficult. I mean, I was always taught to use the word what if, or the words what if on every single policy you do. What if it doesn't do this? What if it does? And it doesn't appear there's any what's if in here. Sorry, back to you, Bob.
Thanks, Convener. I found that whole exchange really helpful to understand how we scrutinise this as a committee and as a parliament. So I'd mentioned modelling. So my set question is a wee bit about modelling, so I'll do that. So the plan sets out that there was a bottom-up approach to analysis using, and I quote, various analytical models and estimation approaches appropriate to each context. Now, most people have glazed over at that sentence, quite frankly. So I ask you, without really knowing what that means in practice, but I have just read it out, in your view, are the data sources and methods used in the analysis transparently communicated? Good luck with taking that one first. Who would like to have a go at that? Neil, I see you sitting there. Yeah.
I'll have a go. So I think I'll start by saying I think we would like more time to be able to take a definitive view on this. We've tried to work through this in pretty short order, and actually this is probably more for the CCC to look at the detail of the modelling. The monitoring evaluation annex I think is helpful, and it starts to take you through some of how those models have worked and the assumptions beneath them. But I think, as everybody's just been saying, that level of detail doesn't seem to be there for some of them. So particularly, I think, in the early years of kind of what is the level, what is the expectation in terms of how things are going to ramp up. So that comes back to, I think, a point I made earlier around the kind of whole governance, and we've talked about contingency here as well, do we have the certainty about what is expected to happen over the next 5 years, and if that doesn't happen, then how are we going to respond to it? So I think there is quite a lot of detail in the annex about the modelling assumptions, but it's quite difficult to follow all of that through to for this particular policy, what are we expecting to see happen? So how many, to meet the targets in terms of heat, domestic heat, how many heat pumps are we expecting to be installed over the next 5 years to meet that target? What we do have here is always there's a lag in terms of the emissions data to know whether you're on track. So one of the positive things in the plan is the talk about the early warning indicators of knowing, you know, if we're going to do so many heat pumps or such a proportion of the car fleet is going to be converted to EV. But for a lot of those, that's a great idea in principle, but the level of detail is not there at the moment. So for a lot of the early warning indicators, we just don't know what they are. So in principle, that's a great idea, but we just don't know what they are. And so in 2 or 3 years' time, when we're trying to see, are we on track with this plan? At the moment, I'm not clear exactly how we'd assess that.
Okay, so a bigger suite of early warning indicators, whatever they mean, Neil, but a bigger suite of those. I think the committee would quite like to know where witnesses believe there are gaps in being able to identify where the data sources have came from, and gaps in relation to details of methods used, because we're not experts on this, but we're pretty good at scrutinising, so we're relying on witnesses to identify to us where those gaps might be. So I think that would be helpful. Are there any other responses or comments in relation to all that, Claire?
It's just in response to that kind of early warning indicators. I think it's a really good point. And, you know, the monitoring and evaluation, we need to know that we've got the right indicators of transitions. Are the transitions that we need to happening at the rate that we need them to happen to meet the budgets? In many ways, one of the things that having or seeing what the kind of underlying model methods are helps you do is understand what those indicators of transition are. Because, say, for example, the models are built on the premise that the spark gap between gas and electricity is 2 times rather than 4 times, then that's kind of an indicator that it's kind of like, yeah, if that changes, then we're getting closer to what the model assumptions need to happen. If we're getting away from that, we know that the models now are we're off model track as well. So in some ways, it's kind of like one of the things about having access to those annexes, it really helps you kind of probe and say, these are the things that we need to happen. These are the conditions. And so these help us understand what these early warning indicators need to be.
Okay. Do you want to respond to any of that, Professor Roy?
No, I mean, I think the general point about modelling, and come back to my earlier point, is that the modelling is really useful as a tool to help you to help inform for the purpose of the committee, the scrutiny and the work they'll do. But a model is only really as good as 4 things that underpin it. So the data, the assumptions, the parameters that link it, and then the uncertainties. And I think there's something in there about, no one's ever going to know the exact detail of the models because they're very complex for very good reasons. But actually understanding what are the uncertainties around it. So what would happen if you changed one element of the pathway? What would happen if you had a change in relative technology? Would it have a big impact on the plans? Would it have a small impact on the plans? And I think that's a bit where I think that gives much more reassurance about how these models are being used and how these models are being applied, and the conclusions that are then drawn from that. Because very clearly you'll see if you modify assumptions in a small way, does it fundamentally change what you're trying to do? And I think that's the bit where looking at the modelling becomes really important.
Okay, can I stick with yourself, Professor Roy? Because my next question was about those risks and uncertainties vis-à-vis, I suppose, interdependencies with other policies, including those of the UK government. And Professor Roy, you'd mentioned about how this plan talks to the budget we're about to have. The Scottish Government doesn't know the numbers that will underpin their budget yet, because that's reliant on a UK Government decision, and that's just for one budget. There are multiple budgets and spending reviews and changes of government way out to 2040, indeed probably just the next 5 years also, Kavina, quite frankly, as well, in the short term. So does the plan set out those interdependencies sufficiently well, and without being, and I really don't mean to be political, we have to be matter of fact about this, building in the risks and those interdependencies in a clear and transparent way? I think that would be quite helpful. Yeah. Professor Roy.
So I think it's a very important point, and I bet it's an element I think gets lost quite a lot in the discussions we have about how the fiscal dimensions of this play out. So, whether Scotland achieves net zero isn't just dependent on what the Scottish Government does, it's what the UK Government do in reserved areas, but it's also dependent on what the UK Government do in devolved areas that then generate the funding under the fiscal framework that let the Scottish Government then decide its policy, and then it depends what the Scottish Government does within all of that. I think being very clear about the different dimensions of that and the potential risks and uncertainties that underpin that is crucial. Again, some of the work that we've done that I think takes it forward from that is to say, where does Scotland differ from the UK in some of the potential investment opportunities, but also potentially some of the risks that go in there. So land use being a good example of that there. And even just looking at that, you can potentially look at where Scotland might have a different position relative to the rest of the UK. And then you can start to work through what the policy implications might be or what the different decisions you might want to take and all of that. But from a fiscal perspective, that interdependency is fundamental to the resources that will be available to the government to be able to deliver on its plan. And again, that's something which I think is really important to acknowledge right up front, that whether you agree with the current fiscal framework or not, whether you'd like to have something different, that interdependency is absolutely crucial.
Okay, I'm just wondering, Professor Roy, and I'll bring another witness who want to make a comment in relation to this as well, whether or not the Scottish Government, given they're being asked for more certainty in their budget commitments to tackle net zero for those first 5 years in the first instance, whether they should be clearer about what they expect they should be getting directly from the UK Government to play their part, not just in terms of what the UK Government does interdependently at a UK basis in reserve matters to meet net zero ambitions, but the money transfer from UK to Scotland for the devolved aspects. So should the Scottish Government be quantifying what they expect, not in a political way, but what they expect to get from the UK Government if there's going to be that partnership approach to funding net zero?
So I guess there's two parts to it. One is is how do you do effective government policy across the UK, where you've got different tiers of government with different responsibilities in that, and that's not just, I think, related to net zero. It's related to economic growth. It's related to a whole manner of different policy areas. Where's that connection? I guess the question we probably all ask ourselves is that joint working on these shared problems as effective as it could be. I think there's probably room for improvement in that. I think the second bit is then where does this come through in terms of the spending review? So we have the UK spending review. So the government, Scottish Government, have in broad terms their block grant Barnett consequentials for the next 4 to 5 years. So that gives an element of certainty there. I think then it comes through as well, given all of that, what are the spending commitments that the government want to put in place in delivering this plan, and is there any potential gap in there that goes from that? Part of that comes back to my question to Douglas around the detail that we should see within the spending review about commitments and all of that. And then that gives the government a chance to basically say, well, here is a gap on what we're essentially planning to spend and the funding. And they've done that at a high level in other areas. So the medium-term financial strategy, for example, talks about a gap between spending commitments and funding at an aggregate level. And there's no reason why you couldn't do that at more granular level if you wanted to as well.
Okay, thanks, Professor Roy. Any other reflections on any other comments in relation to that line of questioning? If they're not, that's fine, but just want to check. Oh, Dr. Dixon.
Thank you. Sometimes when you read a Scottish Government document and you get to the bit about the UK Government, you think, oh no, this is now the bit where they blame the UK Government for not being able to do anything. And I didn't find that in this document. I thought there were lots of sensible sections where it said we need to work together with the UK Government if the UK Government did these policy things. So it wasn't about money. It was about policy things. If these changes happened, then we would be able to do such and such. So I thought it was a sensible approach to how we need to act in these aisles to get the best. And it also stresses the fact that for the UK to meet its climate targets, the UK climate targets, Scotland has to perform well on its climate targets. So I thought that the commentary about cross-border issues was mature and sensible in this document, which is great. I do think, though, I did detect 1 or 2 places where there was a failure of leadership. So on aviation, it talks about most things in aviation and most things in shipping being controlled by the UK Government. And so there's a section in Annex 3 which says we're going to do some things on aviation and the net emissions reduction will be 0 in each of these times. So it's kind of as if Scotland can't do anything about aviation. But of course we can, because there's air departure tax. And the document says quite specifically that we are committed to introducing it, as we have been for more than a decade, but perhaps we'll finally do it. But it is a strong tool. But the implication is that we will introduce it, but set it at such a level where it doesn't make any difference to anyone making a choice about whether they will fly or not. So it is a really important tool because it's a financial message. It's a really important tool to help people make a different decision about whether they will take a plane for this particular journey. So if you're flying to London for business, perhaps you'll take the train because the cost differential has changed. So ADT could help us do that. But the implication of the section in Annex 3 is that we're not bothered about that. I'm not going to do that. And a similar failure of leadership is on oil and gas. And so there is a section on the regional priorities. There's a bit on the priorities for the North East region, where it says geological maturity means that production will gradually decline. So again, implicitly, the Scottish Government is not taking a strategic approach to phasing out oil and gas, our major contributions to global climate change. It's letting the market decide. And that's the worst of all worlds, because if we let the market decide, it means we don't prepare as a government and as a nation, we don't do enough on just transition, on building up the other jobs that people can go to and that communities can be supported by, because we're just letting the market decide. So when the oil companies in 5 years' time decide, oh, it's all a bit expensive operating in the North Sea, we'll shut these down now, and there's a big fall off a cliff moment, we aren't ready for that. Just as we haven't really been ready for the abruptness with which Mossmoran and Grangemouth have shut. We've done some preparatory work, but it's really fallen off a cliff, and now we're in rescue mode rather than delivering a solid plan we already had. So I would much rather see that the Scottish Government has a plan for how rapidly or slowly North Sea oil production will decline, and beside that, how the transition plan will enable workers to move from one to the other being low-carbon jobs, and how communities will be supported through that. So a real, it's difficult for governments to have that kind of detailed plan about communities and industries sometimes, but this is the case where we really, really should be doing that because it's so important.
Dr Dixon, I won't follow up on that, but I think that's a really important point that you make, and it also highlights the interdependence quite clearly in relation to mapping all this out is going to have real, serious, proper and mature partnership work between the UK and the Scottish Government. So I think that's a really helpful thing to put on the record. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Now, sorry, I'm not sure, Deputy Convener, whether I saw your hand up, whether you wanted to come in or whether I've misread a signal that you were giving. You're live. We should be able to hear you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I was wanting to just come in the back of the question, the response from Richard, particularly around the issue of air departure tax and also the issue of oil and gas. 2 points. The first is that obviously there are fiscal challenges around the arrangement for an air departure tax and the potential impact it could have on inter-island flights, which the Scottish Government have been seeking to get resolved with the Treasury for the best part of a decade now, which hasn't been resolved. So I just wonder whether he's taken that into account and highlighting it in areas where he thinks there's a lack of leadership. And the second area is in the issue of the Scottish Government setting out what it thinks is the timeline or the process for reducing our reliance on oil and gas production. How do you expect the Scottish Government to deliver on that when it's not responsible for the licensing of exploration or the extraction of oil and gas in the North Sea?
Very much. So on the first point, ADT, so the initial reason that this didn't proceed was because we were still part of the European Union, and there was a question debated with the European Commission about whether we could make exemptions or change the rates for island flights. And I don't think there's anyone in the country who thinks that there isn't a special case there. So the moral case is absolutely made. It's the practicalities. Obviously, when we left the EU, that blockage no longer existed, but then suddenly it became an issue with the UK government about whether we could make these exemptions. And it kind of beggars belief that for 9 years we can't have come up with an answer to a question that everyone knows the right answer to. So I'm a little sceptical about whether that stalling is actual stalling or whether that's a real blockage. So I think, as I say, I think everyone agrees that the flights to the islands are a special case and that ADT could be used in a number of ways. You could use it really quite sophisticatedly. So some have proposed that you could use it in the way that people have proposed a frequent flyer levy. So if you're someone who flies to Europe to go shopping in a European capital 7 times a year, you'll start to pay a large amount. Whereas if you're a family who goes once to Disneyland in Paris, you won't pay so much. And so there are sophisticated ways which we think, I know there's been a piece of work done, which suggests that we could use ADT in quite a sophisticated way to target people who take lots of flights. Or, as the French have done, French have actually banned flights on short distances that you could do by train. We could do that. Well, maybe we could do that. But we could certainly set the rate of ADT to disincentivise short flights where there is a viable train alternative. So it's quite a sophisticated tool that we still can't use because we haven't managed to actually implement it, despite having had the powers to put it in place for over a decade. On the oil and gas industry, I think you're quite right that we're caught in a cross-border problem where we don't control licensing, although we control a lot of onshore licensing and permitting stuff that's related. But by simply saying, well, it's all too difficult, we can't do anything, we are actually letting down workers and communities. So the government does have Just Transition plans, has a Just Transition fund, there is activity, but it's always seemed to me, this was my personal view, it's always seemed to me that that is a much more real discussion if you acknowledge, as communities and workers and as the Scottish Government, that the oil industry is on a declining path and will be mostly gone by a certain date. And we can all argue about when that date is. But that then helps focus the mind on, well, that means we've got 10 years to build up this many alternative jobs in clean industries. And, of course, the decline path that you specify should be based on climate considerations. So you should be saying Scotland's emissions need to decline by this much over this timescale, and the oil industry is producing so much. But actually, of course, we're also exporting most of that oil. So that's creating climate change somewhere else that we are helping to happen. So again, what is our obligation to turn that tap off gradually and help those communities and workers make that transition? So, you know, the environmentalists at one end would tell you you've got about 5 years left. Many politicians would say, in exactly these words, we will still be taking out oil and gas for decades to come, and the truth must be somewhere in the middle of those things. But it seems to me some clear statement from the Scottish Government about the future employment within the industry and the downward trajectory of that would be very helpful in stimulating more action and more seriousness from all the stakeholders around the just transition debate.
Yeah, look, that's helpful. I think just sticking with the issue of oil and gas, I think it's, I think we've got to be realistic about what we can expect the Scottish Government to do in this space. The decisions around exploration, extraction, all rest with the UK Government. There's very little that the Scottish Government can actually do to change the use of the existing or those still to be exploited oil and gas fields in the North Sea. The timeline for deciding on how that will be taken forward rests solely with the UK Government. The issue about it being a declining basin has been acknowledged and recognised for the best part of a decade, if not longer. And the North East Transition Fund is a reflection of the fact that it is a declining basin in order to address it. So I would actually put to you that I think the Scottish Government have already acknowledged that, and some of the work that they're doing is to address some of these issues, but to actually set a timeline for when we will effectively stop extracting oil and gas from the North Sea is not something that's in the gift of the Scottish Government.
I think it's like any of these things we've been talking about. It's defining a pathway, an ideal pathway by which we think things should happen, even if we don't control them. And we had an important moment where Nicola Sturgeon said there should be no more oil and gas licences. And we've got somewhat backwards where the current government is not well disposed to new licences, but uses the shield of there should be an appropriate assessment about climate compatibility. So we've gone a little backwards from a rather strong position that the previous First Minister had. And that's helpful in putting political pressure on the UK government. And the UK government, of course, went into the election saying that they would issue no more oil and gas licences, and they're now looking quite wobbly on that. And it depends where you define new in relation to a licence. So is it brand new, or is it already in the pipeline? Is it an early stage in the pipeline, but still you let it proceed? So that commitment is looking less interesting than it was. But as I said, one of our biggest contributions, perhaps our biggest single contribution to damaging the global climate, is the oil and gas that we produce in Scotland, most of which we sell. And so if we sit here and think climate change is really important, there's an emergency, we're going to do lots about it, but we don't do anything about the many millions of tonnes that are produced by the oil and gas that we sell somewhere else. We just think that's someone else's problem. That country needs to think about its own emissions and do something about its use of oil and gas. That seems to be a morally incorrect position. We should be thinking, well, we produce this. Even if someone else burns it, we produce it. We should be thinking what to do about that.
Thanks, Convener.
Okay, Kevin's wanting to come in on this particular point.
Thank you, Convener. And I think the oil and gas situation is a very interesting one. The North Sea is a declining basin. But one of the major difficulties in all of this, and Dr. Dixon said there, well, even if it's not in your control, you should be dealing with it anyway, which I think is a bit nonsensical. What we also have to realise, of course, is that there will be a continued need for oil and gas in years to come. And does Dr. Dixon think that it would be better for us to continue extraction from the North Sea to meet the demands that are required? Or does he think it would be better to import LNG from the likes of Qatar or other regimes a much greater carbon cost? I think in all of this, what is sadly lacking, and it's entirely down to the UK government, is a strategy in terms of energy security, what needs will be in terms of assessments, and of course the carbon outcomes as well. Because I think it would be a bit daft and blow everything out of the water if we were creating even greater carbon footprints by importing lots and lots of oil and gas from elsewhere.
Answer that, Richard, which I think was more of a statement than a question, but I'm sure you'll find a question in there to answer. I'm just going to allow a wee amnesty. About 3 times during this meeting, somebody's telephone's bleeped. Now, if it's yours and it's in your pocket, could you silence it? Because I find it really distracting, and it's something I feel very strongly about. So if it happens again, there might be a bit of a hunt to find out who's to blame. So on that basis, turn it off now if you're guilty. If not, Richard, answer the question.
Thank you very much. So I don't find my statement about saying something about the future of oil and gas nonsensical. The Scottish Government has never found it hard to say something about what should happen on issues which are actually reserved when they're important. So on nuclear weapons, the Scottish Government has plenty to say, even though it doesn't control what happens. And so I was merely suggesting that the government should say ideally what should happen and how that would mesh with its own just transition plans, even though it doesn't control it, because that is then an input to UK government considerations. And then secondly, clearly nobody wants to be shipping containers full of LNG around the place. It's got a very high energy intensity to produce LNG and then to release the potential of it back into the fuels you want. So nobody is suggesting that's a good idea. But should we need to have oil and gas after we don't produce it anymore, there are much closer, much lower carbon European sources, particularly the Norwegians, should we actually need to import any. But again, by setting an end date and a descent path, that then sets the trajectory for how quickly we have to adapt our society away from oil and gas. And we're already doing that in some ways, so you won't be able to install a new gas boiler in homes soon. You won't be able to buy a petrol or diesel car or van by 2030. They will get phased out eventually. In fact, market economics will make them fall off a cliff pretty much. So actually what we need oil and gas for, all of those demands are disappearing. And so we shouldn't let oil companies decide how long the North Sea oil gets produced. We should have a strategic discussion and decision by the government about that.
The UK government, who are in charge of those strategies at this moment in time, of course with input from the Scottish Government.
The Scottish Government should come to its view and argue that with the UK Government, I would say.
Okay.
I think you've argued it at that point eloquently enough, Mr. Stewart, so I'm going to move on to the next questions, which come from Monica Lennon. Monica.
I think I'm lost for words now, Convener. That's been very interesting. It's always great to have you here, Dr. Dixon. I'm going to come to you first because I do want to turn to the importance of monitoring and evaluation of the climate change plan, but want to pick up this thread about just transition. And I think what you've just been saying there to the committee is really important, and I hope both the UK and Scottish governments are listening. So it's a very obvious question, but how important is monitoring the progress of the climate change plan, and what are your perspectives on the two-track approach to monitoring that is set out in the plan at the moment, and the inclusion of just transition indicators for the first time? I obviously want to hear from the rest of the panel, but I'll come to Dr. Dixon, and of course if Neil wants to add to that, that would be great.
Yes, I think Neil might have more technical insight into some of this, but I think it's very welcome that just transition, first of all, is woven quite firmly throughout the plan. So each section, talking about the sector of emissions, talks about just transition. And the fact that there's a proposal for a monitoring framework for just transition is really important because it's quite a hard thing to monitor. And so the fact that that's proposed there for us to debate and to refine is really positive. Very glad to see that. And I think one of the things that concerns me is what do we do when we find we're going off track? So in the 2009 Act, there was a Section 36 report. So if the government missed an annual target, it had to produce a report saying what new policies or accelerated policies would help to catch up for those missed emissions. So that was a very direct annual process for catching up when we went off track. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't work, but it was a good mechanism. And I think we've lost that. And because we've moved to 5, we don't have annual targets, so that annual pressure isn't really there. We will have reports from CCC telling us how we're doing, so we'll know if we're off track, and we'll have the government's own monitoring, which also will tell us if we're off track. But how Parliament will hold Cabinet Secretaries and Ministers accountable to make sure we get back on track, I think is now a bit less clear in the 5-year budget world than it was in the annual target world. And so that monitoring and evaluation, which I think the reports that the Scottish Government has done every year monitoring the progress on implementing the CCPU have been really good. Hardly anyone reads them, but they're really good, and they're very honest about where we're on track and where we're not on track. So I would like to see exactly that kind of format continue so that we have that honest picture. We have the view that comes from CCC and we have the annual monitoring reports. And so adding just transition into that is also very helpful. But it does mean Parliament making sure that it's calling all that information in and interrogating it, and particularly interrogating ministers about where things haven't gone so well, what they're doing about it. And I think that because the Section 36 report's disappeared, I think that's more of a proactive activity rather than reactive activity now for parliamentarians.
Thank you. And Neil, did you want to add to that?
I think to talk to the point about the twin track approach, I think that is very welcome because, as mentioned earlier, there's a kind of 2 to 2.5 year time lag in terms of getting the emissions data. So we won't, if you're relying purely on that, you won't know for some time whether you're on track or not. So the idea of using early warning indicators is very much a welcome one. But as I said earlier, we don't yet know what a lot of those indicators are. They haven't been set out yet. So the proof of the pudding will be in the eating of kind of what are those indicators and are we on track with them. And that talks very much to the point that we made earlier about the kind of governance arrangements around the plan and whether we'll know we're on track. I know that was something that I think Audit Scotland picked up on in one of their reports about governance of the plan. So it comes back to whether this is going to be delivered and are we going to make the progress that we need to see. So I think the twin track approach is very welcome. But as I say, I think it sounds a bit like we're always asking for more detail, but we do need to know what those indicators are so we can tell are they realistic enough, and therefore what are we needing to see, which also comes back to the point of the kind of modelling and if those indicators are we need 100,000 heat pumps a year, are we getting 100,000 heat pumps a year, or are we getting 110, or are we getting 90,000? So I think that's the kind of key to this will be how does that play out in practice, and are we able to kind of monitor and evaluate that? So from an ESS perspective, that would very much be around us looking at the effectiveness of the delivery mechanisms to deliver on the legislation.
That's great, thank you. And Professor Roy?
So on the monitoring and evaluation point, I think that is really important. It comes back to part of my earlier remarks about the links through to the annual budget process and the importance of having a really clear connection between decisions that are taking place in the budget and then how they feed through to the delivery of this plan, and crucially how the plan is being monitored to then see, well, do budget decisions need to change on the back of the evidence that's coming through. And again, it doesn't have to be just in the budget, but obviously the government every year publish a medium-term financial strategy, which is by definition looking at beyond the immediate horizon of the budget. So again, that needs to speak to it as well. And in the point about just transition, I think there is a really important fiscal dimension, which we've talked a lot about so far about if you take oil and gas in terms of what you might do within policy elements in there. But there's a really important element within the just transition, which is about what's the net tax contribution of different sectors to the economy. And we do know from the evidence that we track around net tax positions on income tax that one of the key challenges has been in Scotland over the last few years has been a decline in the relative contribution of the high-earning oil and gas sector and jobs in the North East. So again, a key element of that just transition is how much do you protect that kind of prized income tax contribution over time. And clearly, if you can have a transition of the sector into high-value supportive jobs, then that is a successful answer. There's a really important fiscal element that matters that I don't think can be ignored in here as well. And the contribution the sector has made historically and still currently will really matter in terms of the overall fiscal position. And how you manage that is going to be absolutely crucial.
Mm-hmm. And just to expand on that slightly before I move to Claire, the pace of that transition then I assume is important, particularly when we have the declining basin. We've seen a number of jobs drop off in the northeast of Scotland, and it's been well documented what's happened in Grangemouth, and now we have a live situation in Westmoreland as well. But there is a feeling out there across Scotland, particularly in these key communities, that they don't really see evidence of a just transition. And it might be that, in terms of that connection with place, it will look quite different. But from a government perspective, the pace of that transition in terms of the fiscal element of it, how important is it that there is an acceleration of pace?
Yeah, I mean, if you purely look at it from a fiscal perspective, what we do know under again, whether you would agree or disagree with the fiscal framework that we have for Scotland, what really matters is high quality jobs, high paid jobs. That's the thing that matters. And the way the framework is set up is about Scotland's relative position compared to the rest of the UK. So if you've got a situation where you're losing high value jobs or you're not creating high value employment, then that has a relative fiscal implication for Scotland relative to the UK under the framework that we have. So whatever your views about the pace of transition, whatever your views about the importance of different sectors, getting it right and protecting high-value jobs and creating high-value jobs in whatever sector is fundamental to Scotland's long-term fiscal position and fiscal sustainability. And that is not to say that what matters in communities and I think is really important, and it is, but there's also a really hard-edged budget implication with all of this as well that we need to get right.
Thank you. And Claire, just to add to the original question for yourself, does the national approach set out in the plan align with local data sources and local approaches?
Yeah, in many ways, yes. So our recommendation to local authorities is virtually the same as with the Scottish Government, the approach the Scottish Government has taken, which is to say, you know, we can't use emissions as the way that we track this transition because they're too slow and laggy and actually too fuzzy in many ways. So what we really need is to kind of see what are the indicators of transition that we need to happen. So for local authorities, often those transitions are around, you know, modal shift, EV registrations, heat pumps installed, heat networks connected to, and these things help us kind of map out, you know, are we moving at the pace? I guess my feeling is that as well, if you're going to have a monitoring and evaluation, that's essentially monitoring and evaluating policies. So the first question is the policy, has it been delivered? Do we know what delivered looks like in the context of each policy? Because sometimes it's we've got to set a target, sometimes it's we've got to do some research, and sometimes it's that we've got to pull a lever. And so how do we know that that's done? The second thing then is that working, which means that we need to be a bit more nuanced about what it is that we expect it to do and therefore what we expect the shift that we see to happen. I have actually read some of the monitoring and evaluation reports. Could we build a dashboard so that people could actually see what's going on without having to read through a 50-page PDF and track the policies they're interested in against and find them? You know, it's kind of like if this is something that really matters to us and that we want it to matter to people, we can make it a bit more apparent what's working and kind of go, it's like actually this one totally moving on this one a bit stalled, this is what our process is for kind of unstalling it. Because at the moment it's, you know, the monitoring evaluation sort of seems to be it's a bit of a hidden process behind, and actually it needs to be really upfront, I think, on the website in ways that people can understand. So I think
on that point, I think you've made a really important suggestion. So is it your assessment at the moment that more work needs to be done to make sure that this information is more accessible and understandable to the public? And in terms of as a public dashboard, would it be your recommendation that that should be not just like national in focus, but have that local and regional data as well, so that people, wherever they are in the country, can get a sense of how things are going in their own communities?
I think ideally there would be, yeah. I mean, it would be lovely to be able to do this. It's kind of nationally, we're winning on these bits, and in your local area you can kind of drill down and go, and I can see what's happening here. You know, our fuel poverty figures, statistics tracking in my area. There's a lot of data that needs to be pulled in. At the moment, a lot of the indicators are set as year-on-year increase is seen as the kind of like that's how you win, but clearly, when we look at the plan, year-on-year increase doesn't cut it. It's kind of year-on-year exponential growth is what we need. So we need to be clear about, you know, what is it that we need to... And I understand that, you know, we've just moved away from annual targets and people are really reluctant to try and set new annual targets. But, you know, there are annual targets implicit in this plan. Maybe we just need to make them explicit and see, you know, are we on track with the tempo? Because if we're not, we need to do something differently. So yeah, I think I would like it to be more apparent. And I think sometimes this helps us kind of look at the policies that aren't actually really policies, because sometimes you look at a policy and you go, I don't know what this is meant to do, and I don't know how it's meant to work, and I don't know what it's going to deliver, and I can't think of a monitoring and evaluation indicator for it. And I think at the point when we don't know what it does and how it works and who does it and how much it's going to cost and what it's going to do, it's probably not a policy. It's probably, you know, either we know what it does and we know why we're doing it, or we don't know, in which case we could knock it off the list and end up with the ones that really probably actually matter.
Have you got anything in particular in mind when you say policies that are not really policies?
If a policy has 3 verbs, explore the possibility of convening a group to discuss, it's not a policy. It's, you know, we're fiddling while Rome burns. If the policy is to set a target that is essentially consistent with the other targets that we've already set, unless there is something very firm around that target and there's consequences to not meeting the target, if it's just setting a target, it's also probably not a policy. And if the policy is to do some research about what we should be setting a policy on, it's not a policy, it's research. If a policy doesn't do something, or doesn't make something happen, or doesn't pull a lever, it's probably not a policy.
Yeah, we're really getting down to basics here today, but thank you.
Sorry,
Claire, that is helpful. I think everyone agrees that we need clarity and policy certainty. Right, a couple of things have been mentioned, and I'll just try and be really brief, convener. So, obviously we know there's been the delay in emission reporting. We've moved to the 5-year carbon budgets as opposed to annual targets. Early warning indicators have been mentioned a few times today already. Again, if I can just maybe get a couple of words from our panel today about the importance of these early warning indicators and the kind of data they should ideally be capturing, not just for the benefit of a Scottish Government, but other stakeholders who are really part of this journey. And how do we get more immediate feedback on both progress and risks? I don't know if Professor Roy, because you've obviously talked about fiscal sustainability, some of the risks around that. Is it okay to come to you initially?
Yeah. I mean, I think the point about early warning indicators is really crucial. I think one thing I would say, clearly there's the kind of reporting that will go behind the climate change plan on a regular basis. I come back to my earlier point, though. I think the importance of how this document speaks to the budget, and then how budget decisions are then being fed through to that, I think is absolutely fundamental, because that's the element where you'll see whether action is being taken. And historically, the government have published and said, well, these are the carbon emissions from all our various budget activities, which again is very broad and useful, but very high level. I guess the proof will really be coming and saying, you know, this is what we plan to do over the next 5 years in our carbon budget. And these are the fiscal levers that we're pulling. These are the fiscal expenditures we're taking that are going to deliver us onto that. Picking up on Bob Doris's point about saying this is what we also need to happen at a UK level and interactions in there, but having that laser focus on these are the things that we're doing that deliver that for me is the key bit. And then you can pick up where you are lagging behind or where you haven't made a decision, and you'll come back to that. But it's that you'll get that every year in the budget process.
Thank you. Any final comments on that before I hand back to the convener? No, back to you, convener.
Okay. So just before what I'm going to do is I'm going to just ask a question, and then we're going to have a brief pause to allow people to stretch their legs before we come back to the second round of questioning. I mean, it sounds, Claire and Graham, and I think to a certain extent, Richard, you're suggesting that some early warning indicators in here to let us know where we're not achieving targets. I mean, Richard, you mentioned transport, one of our biggest emitters. You've suggested we know some of the things that are happening, like concessionary fares, EV vehicles and such like. But should we have early warning systems written into this plan to say, if we don't achieve this, we need to pay more attention or whatever? Is that what you're suggesting? I'm not putting words into your mouth, Richard, and then I'll come to Graham and Claire.
Yes, so whether they're formally a set of indicators that we're examining regularly or whether it's a narrative discussion, clearly the policies which are supposed to produce big reductions, like the growth of EVs, we need to have a really strong track on that so that we know very quickly if it's going wrong in some way. So if we see a major geopolitical shift that's going to affect it, that's fairly obvious. But if we find that consumers, for some reason, have decided they don't really like EVs, and so the transition is going much more slowly, we need to get on that really quickly so that we either do something about it to put it back on track, or understand that we've got to do something else in another sector or in the transport sector to make up for those emissions that are not disappearing because that policy isn't delivering as quickly as possible. So yes, so for the big ones, we definitely need to be really on the ball to know this isn't working, or isn't working as to the extent that we predicted that it would.
Graham.
Yeah, and I think that the flip of that, of course, as well, is where there's opportunities or where things have moved in the positive direction about where potentially you might make changes. I mean, in many ways, I guess the discussion that we're having is no different to the discussion that the Social Security Committee might be having about the plan to reduce child poverty, and how do you track that progress over time and then take corrective action in the key areas that you've got policy levers in there. It's another area where, again, just as what Doris said, is there'll be decisions at the UK level or just things that happen in the economy that will impact on that target, but being able to track and monitor that on a regular basis, you'll then be able to see where you can make the policy decisions. And I think that comes back to the point about having really clear indicators about how progress is doing, and then, crucially, being very clear about the policies that you are setting out, what they cost, and the read-through to what you think will be a reduction in emissions.
Claire.
Yeah, I mean...
Sorry, that was very perfunctory. I didn't mean that like that.
you can call them early warning indicators, you can call them success indicators, because hopefully that's what they are, is that they actually kind of show you that what you're doing is working. I guess it's, as well, it's kind of coming back to Richard's point, the more critical a policy area is in the first 5 years, and I guess it's kind of like you can set the system up for 5 years, you don't need it to do to 2040, we're only concerned in this budget essentially, is to be a bit nuanced. I think sometimes, so say for example EVs, you might end up with a kind of like, we're getting a lot of, with the number of EVs registered is going up, the proportion of EVs as the fleet is staying the same, which what it means is your fleet is getting much bigger. So you have to kind of go, what does it, is there something we need to track, and then the other things that we need to track to make sure it's actually doing what we want it to do, because the emissions are lagged and they're going to take a while to kind of show up. So I think you have to be, yeah, the bigger the policy, the more important the policy is to delivering those budgets, the more warning we need that it's not working. And, you know, if we've got money, if, you know, this budget kind of association with it is like we're spending, say, for example, we're spending 188 million a year on active travel and public transport, and we're getting no modal shift. We need to do either, we need more money, or we need more disincentive, or we need to do something slightly different. And we need to use that data to kind of work out what it is that we need to push in the system a bit better. But I think as a kind of straightforward indicator to the public is them knowing that this is part of people's security about this, is knowing that the plan is delivering the transitions that we think it should deliver. And people get secure when they know that what's going to happen. It's a framework of kind of, yeah, we know what we're doing. We know why it works.
All about buy-in. And on that note, we'll reconvene at 11:10. And I briefly suspend the meeting till that time. Thank you.
Try not to spill this one.
Did you fill it?
I spilt my water. It could have been worse.
Okay, thank you and welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. And we're going to go straight to the Deputy Convener, whose team has been clearly emblazoned over the monitors this morning as he took drinks from his cups of coffee. On that basis, Michael, over to you, and it can't be about football.
Thanks, Convener. Can I pick up on the issue around governance? And it's been touched on in the earlier part of the meeting. And we've discussed the issue of data, being able to track progress or lack of progress, the need to have clarity around policy and their distinction between targets and other broader aspects. And Richard also touched on the fact that there's no provision for a Section 36, the additional catch-up report that Scottish Government had to produce annually, where it wasn't making sufficient progress. I'd be grateful to get the witnesses' views on whether they feel that the governance arrangements that are set out by the government around this you believe they are sufficient, or whether you think there are measures that could be taken by the government to help to support the governance process around its draft climate change plan. And can I come to you first, Claire, particularly given that governance aspects will also have a role to play in accountability, and that could be at different levels of government, local government being a key part of the delivery mechanism around the climate change plan. Do you think the governance arrangements are sufficient?
I think it would be, well, first of all, it would be really useful to have a little bit more, probably in the form of a diagram, detail in the plan about how, I guess, how that progress against delivering the plan feeds into the checks and balances of Parliament. You know, which committees look at this, which boards are accountable to it. But I suspect that this is a plan of many policies across many departments. So in many ways, what's really important as well is to be really clear about which policies, which department holds which policy, and then who is the delivery agent for that policy. Is it the government itself? Is it local authority partners? Is it the private sector? Is this something that households need to do? So I think that kind of both who owns it and who delivers it is kind of what we need to know. And then a bit of an overall umbrella of, you know, on an annual basis, who's in charge of deciding whether we're winning or not.
Neil, Richard?
Yeah, I think at the moment the governance arrangements are not sufficiently clear for the plan. I think part of this goes back to the discussion we had earlier about the modelling assumptions and expectations. So how many of what are we expecting by when is not yet, I think, clear enough to then be able to track that. So I mentioned earlier again about the early warning indicators, which, as I say, we think are a really positive step forward, and in principle they'll really help us. But we don't know what all of those are yet, and it's not yet possible to kind of trace that back to the individual policies and proposals to know what's expected to be happen by when. And I think ownership and responsibility for delivery of various of the policies in the plan are not yet clear enough. One of the things I think we thought when reading the plan was that if I was a public authority, if I was a local authority reading this plan, would I know what was expected of me and when? And I think the short answer is no, I wouldn't. For some of it, possibly, but not for all of it, definitely.
Do you think that if there's a lack of ownership around around the governance processes, that can compromise accountability for the progress or lack of progress in key areas?
I think it can, and I think it also really does kind of jeopardise the progress against the plan in future, and whether we'll be able to kind of keep us to that, and what will we do? We've already talked a bit about contingency here, but knowing whether we're on track, which policies are doing well, which policies are not doing well, we need to be able to know who's responsible for those, and then to be able to think through what are we going to do to make up any gaps that appear. So I think that it's really kind of critical to delivery of this, is that there's clear accountability, there's clear ownership, clear responsibility of what's expected of whom by when.
Yeah, that's helpful. I wonder if I'm going to turn to Graham here, because obviously quite a considerable part of the change that will be needed to meet our climate change targets will require private sector investment. And I'd be interested in getting your views on whether you feel that if there's a lack of clear leadership and ownership of policy within the government's climate change plan, whether that has or runs a potential risk of it making it difficult for the private sector to have a clear understanding on where they see the government's priorities as being, and how they should then target their investment in these areas, which then obviously, if there's a lack of clarity, it could have an economic impact in our economy in the medium to longer term.
And I think first of all, I think it's a really great question. It comes back to some of the points we had about uncertainty and the different agents that are involved in all of this to deliver that. I mean, so one aspect where I think it is really important, and I keep going on about this, but I think it is fundamental, both in terms of actual action, but also to give that certainty and that clarity of direction of travel, is how this document speaks to the annual budget process. So where do you have the very clear plans that this is what the government said they would do, and these are the investments that we're making over a period of time, so both for the next financial year, but also through the spending review. And again, the spending review is going to be really important, because it will set out clearly what the government intend to do over the next 5 years and potentially beyond. And I think that's where being very clear about, for example, if it's in decarbonising of the housing stock, for example, what are the government committing in terms of the levels of investment into that then provide the certainty for private sector investors to be able to see very clearly that this is the direction of travel and the action that the government are taking. Similarly on transport, similarly in different areas in there. And I think that also then becomes really important, because it then also is very clear this is what the government are doing, and the government can be held accountable for that. But then what are the other agents and what are the other actors that are involved in this process, and they can be held accountable as well, whether that be in the private sector or, as we discussed earlier, what is the UK government doing in this space. And I think that's where it comes back, the transparency and being very clear on what the government are doing in terms of the key thing that they can do around spending, but also the broader policy narrative, ultimately will improve accountability.
Okay, thanks. Can I turn to Richard? And you mentioned earlier on the fact that there's no Section 36 in this process now. I wonder. What would you think? What would help and enhance the governance process and the monitoring and tracking of progress or lack of progress? What do you feel would be a positive step that the government could take to change the existing draft plan to make it more transparent and more accountable?
Well, we have 2 points in the year where someone tells us what's happening with the climate change plan. So the CCC will tell us when the emissions figures come out. They will tell us what's happening, whether we're on track, various things, what they think should happen. So that's a very strong steer. And we have the government's own monitoring. So assuming that continues in the same fashion, we'll have annual reports saying this is what's happened with the policies in the CCP. So the bit that's missing is there's no obligation for the government to come to Parliament and talk about those and say what it's going to do where they are not satisfactory. So, and that's not in the law, but it could be in this plan. It could say that every year when those two things happen, ministers will turn up in Parliament to make a statement and explain what they're doing where things are not on track and celebrate where things are actually overperforming as well. So we could kind of fix it after the fact by putting it in the plan to make a commitment that that will happen. If that doesn't happen, then it's really up to this committee's successor as a leader on this issue to make sure that it is proactive in summoning those people from CCC who've done the analysis, from the government statistical people who've done the monitoring assessment of the progress on the plan, to hear from them and then to put that to the appropriate cabinet secretary or minister and say, right, well, what are you doing about this policy which is not working, or what's happening with EVs doesn't seem to be on track, etc. So but that puts the onus on the committee or the whole Parliament to be on the ball to do that, rather than what we've had before, which is a statutory obligation for ministers to come and talk about it, and indeed do something about it.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you. And it would be fair, the committee, I should point out, have also asked future legislation to show where it's moving towards net zero and budget scrutiny to look at where it's achieving the net zero objectives within the plan. So I think the committee has been quite at the forefront of that. Kevin, I think you want to come in with some questions on a different area.
Thank you, Convener. And I want to have a wee look at communication and how the plan is communicated to the public, who are often quite confused about some of these issues and are facing messaging from various polarised views at this moment in time. And I've been sitting here thinking, how would we communicate what is going on at this committee this morning? And it would be baffling, I think, to put that into play and to get that out there. So, in terms of the public messaging, what do you think needs to be done around about the plan? Let's start with Claire, please.
So, net zero is actually a surprisingly technical concept, particularly when you start to look at this plan and you look at the kind of, you know, the below the line, the above the line, the kind of the long way out. So net zero is almost like it's a product that people don't know why they need it and what it's good for. What we do know, and what I think the plan has been actually quite good at explaining, is that putting the net zero concept aside, it's like this is actually about all sorts of things that people do want. So it is about clean, warm homes. It is about sustainable transport options and accessible transport options for all people across Scotland to be able to get to jobs and schools and services. It's about safeguarding environmental, processes. These are all things that people want. In actual fact, there's a huge amount of evidence that also people want governments to take action on climate change. So I don't think we need to change that too much. I think what we do need to do is make it a clear and compelling story that net zero is those things. It's achieving those things, and the way that we are trying to do it in Scotland is in a way that those benefits are distributed relatively equally across society, and the costs of this transition are borne by people who have the ability to pay them, and not by the households that are producing the smallest amount of emissions. So in many ways, it's kind of like, the messaging in here is actually fine. I think the communication of it, 300 odd pages is a large document. I know there is a shorter plan bit of it. I don't think many people are going to read that. So I think somehow a kind of, when you do an EIA, you do a non-technical summary. It'd be nice to have a non-technical summary that just goes, this is what we're trying to do, this is why we're trying to do it, this is how we think it will help.
Dr Dixon?
Thank you. So I think we start from a good place in Scotland in that, as Claire says, if you do surveys of the public, the vast majority think that climate change is important or really important and that we should do something about it. Until recently, we've had a political consensus amongst the parties in the Parliament that net zero is the right place to be aiming for. There is noise out there which is generating more scepticism, but it doesn't seem to be impacting the public that much at the moment. So I agree absolutely that part of the way to communicate this is to present that vision of what your life might be like, where you'll live, what it will be like, the better transport options you'll have. And one I would add to that is also that someone is thinking about the future of your job. If you're in a high-carbon industry, someone is thinking about what low-carbon industry you might be able to move into and how you might be able to be helped to do that. Or if you're in a community in the northeast, that someone is thinking about what's that community going to be like when there aren't oil jobs, but there are offshore wind jobs. How do we make sure that community remains vibrant and healthy? So I think that painting that positive vision is really important, but we mustn't do that to the exclusion of saying, but some things are going to be a bit difficult. This is such a big problem, some things are going to be a bit difficult. So there are some people who say, oh, well, we can go net zero and your life will be pretty much the same, don't worry. That isn't really true. Some things will have to change. And sometimes people, if you tell people you will live in a very nice energy-efficient house, which costs you almost nothing to run, and your job will be from home, and the shops will be just 2 miles away, and you'll be able to cycle on a nice, safe cycle track. If they were magically transformed into that situation, they might find they loved it. But today, from their living on an estate with their fast car, driving to work every day through the crowds, which they think they like, they won't necessarily find that vision attractive, even if they would like it when they get there. So we need to be a bit careful also with visions that we think are attractive, but normal people won't quite put themselves in that place. So I agree visions of what the future might look like and the positive benefits are really important. And the plan itself is good at thinking about the positive opportunities. But we also need to make sure that there are consistent messages coming from the top. So obviously John Swinney has set achieving net zero as one of his 4 big missions. So that's a big, strong top-line message. And he gives speeches about it, which are well received. But if you look at the actions of government over the last year, we've had the Warm Homes Bill shelved twice, postponed twice, and it's not even mentioned in the climate change plan. We've had the ban on biodegradable waste postponed for the second time, even though it's an important measure in driving more sustainable waste practices. We've abandoned the 2030 and 2040 targets. We've massively weakened the car kilometres 2030 target. So if you're an observer of government, you see some of the things you thought were essential to deliver on the last CCPU seem to be disappearing or being weakened. So there is an issue of political consistency in the actions of government, which people can observe and see, yes, they're serious about this because they're still doing this and this and this. So I agree, visions, very important. Top-level messages, really important, and we're getting those. The mostly political consensus we have around the Parliament is very important. But also consistency in day-to-day announcements, making sure that we don't appear to be slackening off on net zero when things are delayed or postponed or cancelled.
Mr Langhorne.
So I think this comes back to some of the points I've talked about earlier in terms of that clarity of what we expect to see happening when. So I think the plan does a good job in terms of setting out some of the high-level benefits and how we'll try and move with a just transition. But I think, again, it comes back to the point about being clear on what's expected by when. So what does that look like to me? You know, how many warm home programs are we going to do? What percentage of the fleet is expected to be EVs by such and such? And I think Claire mentioned earlier is also being clear on what kind of support and incentives are available to me as an individual. So it's both that kind of high level, I think, of this is where we're going, this is what we're expecting to do, this is what we're expecting to deliver by such and such by such and such a date. So we can see whether we're on track with that. But then also kind of what does that mean to me as an individual and my community, I think is something we would help to communicate it.
Professor Roy, please.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking an economic forecaster to how good we are at communications, so I caveat that immediately. I think there's a couple of things. I think there's important, we're naive to think that this is a document everybody is going to pick up and read and work with. I think one of the core bits, I think, is about how do we communicate with the people who really need to understand this and actually go into action this and scrutinise this, because I think that is, there's two different elements of who you're trying to communicate and get to understand that. And then I think for the general public as well, having that reassurance that things like this are being scrutinised, they are being actioned, they are being planned is really important. And again, a lot of the stuff that we do in the economy is building on the conversation we've had just there, is about how do you actually make this realistic and real to people. So it's what does this mean in terms of your job? What does this mean in terms of your home? What does this mean in terms of your travel to work? That's actually what people care about and what matters.
That's about the bottom dollar, basically.
Yeah.
And to take folk with us, that's what we have to message, without a doubt. I'm interested in the fact that lots of folk spoke about vision. Dr. Dixon, you talked about consensus, and that there's been consensus in this place. I think that consensus is disappearing, and I think in the next Parliament this may be a very different place when it comes to these discussions. So where does logic fit into this rather than vision in terms of the communication? Professor Roy, your mic's still on, so let's go to you first, please.
I think we again have to deal with it. We deal with this quite a lot in our economic work, where you'll start off with assumptions that you believe are logical, but actually they're potentially open to challenge or open to nuance, or people have different opinions in there. And I think there is a risk that sometimes we start with this as being, well, it's obvious that this is right, and why can you not agree with this? And I think we have to be more open and humble and aware that there are different opinions and all of that. I think part of it then is about what's the role of evidence and what's the role of value and how do we communicate the evidence. And I think there is sometimes a risk in coming back to the very first point that where a plan or where you present something as being, we've done some modelling and the answer is X and here's a specific number, that creates long-term risks about how you communicate that, because that number will change and that potentially risks undermining confidence in the broader narrative that you're doing in there. So I think there is a balance between being very clear about where we've got evidence and what's the parameters, what's the uncertainties around that, but not presuming that that evidence is always taken as being complete fact. And there'll be some variations around that, and how you communicate that is going to be really important. And I guess the point I would make as well is about the resilience of the plan, both to changing economic outcomes, both to changing preferences, both to changing technologies. That, I think, is the ultimate success of a plan, is how resilient it is to differences that are going to emerge, that we know are going to emerge over the next 25 years.
So basically what you're describing, because things inevitably will change, is that this plan has to be a living document and change as we progress. When we are able to achieve certain things, when we find that we're unable to achieve certain things, we have to make that change. And we have to communicate to the public, surely, if we are going to be logical about all of this. And this is a living document that's likely to change as we progress.
And that's no different to some of the other big challenges you will have around, how do we tackle child poverty, for example? How do we deal with an ageing population? There are lots of uncertainties and unknowns around that, but we know that these are big challenges that we have to meet. The specific path we take will vary and evolve over time, but ultimately the overall objective is clear.
Anyone else want to come in on that? Living document and communicating that, Dr. Dixon, please.
Just two things which help us in communication. I hear absolutely what you say about the next Parliament may have more sceptics in it, potentially. That's going to be difficult to deal with. But I think we have two important things on our side in making the case for strong action on climate change. One is our international obligations as an industrialised country, having pioneered quite a bit of the stuff that made climate change happen in the Industrial Revolution. We have a moral obligation to do the right thing. And for quite a lot of audiences in Scotland, that's really important, that we have a moral obligation. We're doing our bit for the international community. So we shouldn't forget to keep talking about that. And then secondly, a lot of what we do is based on advice from the Committee on Climate Change. So here's a group of independent of government scientific experts who are defining the pathway, which we've accepted, or defining the 3 budgets, defining the pathway which we've mostly accepted, and in some cases giving us quite specific details on what we might do in policy. So that's helpful for the government and anyone trying to defend this plan to be able to say, well, this has come from well thought out, independent scientific advice, and actually by a body which works for the UK government as well, so it's well integrated across the 2 administrations. And so again, that's in terms of saying where it comes from factually, that's also on our side.
Okay, anyone else want to come in? Claire, please.
I mean, it's I think that this has got to be a live, agile plan because this is a very, very fast-moving area. I think that this is one of the reasons why I think it makes it tricky. You know, I think the job that the people who put the plan together were given was incredibly difficult because writing something that is going to last for 5 years that covers 15 years is a really difficult task. I would give the example of Sweden because what Sweden do is that they have basically a live online plan and they update it every 2 weeks with their policies, what has changed with the policies, new policies, policies that have essentially finished and been retired. It's highly likely, but that at the end of this 5-year period, some of these policies will have evolved, some of them will have been dropped, some of them will have been added, and keeping a track of that kind of like evolving policy landscape is an incredibly difficult thing. So if we want people to be able to kind of come along in this journey and deliver what needs to be delivered, to a certain extent, we need to keep people up to date about what it is they need to deliver. And I think that, you know, this is where we've ended up. We have a lot of plans and strategies and policies and more route maps than, you know, and to be perfectly honest, if that's what made things happen, we would be well on the way by now because clearly we've got plenty of them. So it might be that this approach needs a slightly different, more live, agile planning approach to it. But I think, you know, that idea of, as well, that we have to kind of, that this only gets delivered through consensus is probably not the case. There's plenty of places where we don't have consensus around all sorts of things. What we constantly do in a democracy is find the kind of the transitions of consensus. And clearly, you know, we don't need to agree about everything in 2040 because we don't know who's going to make decisions in 2040. We do need to agree what we're going to do next week. And I think we've got a fairly clear idea of what we need to do next week. So sometimes it's like we don't have to agree on absolutely everything. We just need to agree on what we do next.
I agree that we're not always going to get consensus. It would be nice if we all reached logical positions, but in today's world, you know, that is going out the window as well. I want to turn to effective oversight, and we've discussed what the successor committee to this one should do, what Parliament should do. I would go beyond this committee because you know, climate change is a thread that goes right through government now, and I would say that every committee has an obligation to scrutinise here. But I want to look at independent bodies and how they can provide oversight for climate policy over the course of the next Parliament. What do you think needs to be done in that regard in terms of achieving that effective oversight? Richard?
Obviously, we have the Committee on Climate Change, who have a role to assess annually progress and to advise on budgets and to advise on policy programmes to reach those budgets. So they're kind of the key player, and we have a duty not to duplicate things that they're doing in ESS. We have an MOU with them to make sure that we work effectively together but don't duplicate effort. So I think they've done a great job of every year saying to the government where things are at and what needs to be fixed and how things could be improved. And they are advisors, so the government doesn't have to do anything they say, but they often suggest something that the government then does. What we've lost is the statutory function of ministers going to Parliament to respond to that advice, I think. And so that's what we need to replicate in terms of what happens in committees or in Parliament. But in terms of other bodies, CCC do such a comprehensive job of saying this is on track, this isn't on track, on forestry, why aren't you doing this many hectares this year, etc., that there's a lot of detailed analysis there, which is the right kind of stuff, which they communicate in a fairly, a way that's excellent for a technical audience, including this kind of audience, but is reasonably easy for the public to understand and for journalists to write something about. So I think they do a really good job of that.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in there? Professor Roy Graham, your light's on.
Yeah, so I think two really quick things. I agree entirely with you about the point about the importance of the committee structure, and the committees looking at something like net zero across the board. It can't be segmented at all, and if a lot of the policy issues that we're looking at are going to be in transport or in housing, then that needs to be disseminated right across there, and that's a challenge that the Parliament's had since devolution about how do you have these cross-cutting issues being fed out across there. I think, again, on the fiscal side of things, the ones that I can speak to, I think clearly there's a role for the Scottish Fiscal Commission in the medium term about looking forward. There's a really important role for Audit Scotland about looking backwards and looking at, well, this is what you've spent, this is what you've done, have you achieved the outcomes? And again, that needs to be embedded in across all different portfolios and all different aspects of the Parliament.
Somebody said earlier that investing here is the ultimate case for preventative spend. Sorry, I can't remember who it was. In terms of the Fiscal Commission, in terms of your oversight as we move forward, are you going to have an in-depth look at that preventative spending and what it can achieve in terms of our route to net zero?
Mm-hmm. So we can look, again, our legislation is limited, so that what we can do is that we can look at government policy. So we can't look at alternative options. So when government set out a policy, we can look at what that policy would be, and we could look at this is a trajectory and coming down the line. I think where you start to get into what are the options around preventative spend? So what are the particular time bits that would typically stray out of our remit? But where we can have a remit is to essentially look at what is the planned spending, what are the commitments that are being made, and how then does that feed through to what the government are trying to achieve in terms of the emissions reductions.
Okay. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Kevin. And I'd like to thank everyone for giving evidence this morning. Of course, the formation of the new Parliament will be as a direct result of elections and the choices of the people of Scotland. So if it becomes more difficult Parliament, that is what the people of Scotland have chosen, of course. I found this morning very interesting and discussions about plans. I have set views on plans being about what, where, how, by whom and at what cost and what if scenarios and I've struggled I will be interested to see over the next few months how this plan meets that criteria. And the other thing I should just clarify, I think our consultation finishes on the 5th of March, which is the statutory requirement, and it is up to the government. There is no legal requirement to lay a climate change plan before this end of this Parliament, but they have indicated that they are intending to do so. But there's no statutory requirement for that. So thank you very much. Slightly longer than anticipated, but it is going to be a key focus of this committee between now and the end of the Parliament, and I think it's really important that we drill down into some of those issues. So it's now 11:45. I'm going to suspend the meeting for 5 minutes to allow the witnesses to leave before we move on to our next item of business. So I formally suspend the meeting. Welcome back to the meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. The third item of consideration is a consent notification relating to a proposed UK statutory instrument, the REACH Amendment Regulations 2026. UK registration, evaluation, authorisation and restrictions of chemicals, or UK REACH, is the principal chemicals regulatory framework across Great Britain. It is designed to control the risks that chemicals pose to the people and environment, and it allows the restrictions to be placed on their use, manufacture or sale. This instrument proposes to amend UK REACH by adding certain types of lead ammunition to the restrictions list. The committee's role in relation to the UKSR notifications is to decide whether it agrees with the Scottish Government's decision to consent to the proposed change being made by the UK Government. If we are content for consent to be given, I will write accordingly to the Scottish Government. In writing to the Scottish Government, we have the option to draw matters to the Government's attention, pose questions, ask to be kept up to date on particular matters. If the committee is not content with the proposal, however, it may weigh one of several recommendations outlined in the clerk's note. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to invite members if they wish to make any comments, and I do wish to make some comments, but I'm happy to take other members' comments beforehand. No? Okay, so I'll be quite clear and open and honest with the committee, as I always am, in that I do use lead ammunition for vermin control and the control of deer. In Scotland, I would remind the committee, in 2004, we banned the use of lead shot over Ramsar and wetland sites, which was different to what the rest of the UK did. That, therefore, took the ingestion of lead out of many of or the threat of ingestion of lead out of wildfowl because they wasn't being used over wildfowl areas. This proposal is to remove the use of lead shot, and I would argue that there is no adequate alternative yet available, and what is available is extremely high cost in the form of bismuth and in some cases steel. The issue is, though, however, is that should you choose to replace lead shot, then certain calibers and certain types of guns become unable to be used. For example, shotguns that were made prior to a certain date, probably in around the 70s, will no longer be proofed to use steel shot, and a lot of them will become redundant. Some of the lower caliber, high velocity rifles will also become questionable in their use. For example, the use of a 243 rifle will not develop a sufficient ballistic energy at the point of impact, therefore making it a rifle which would no longer, in my mind, be suitable for the use on large animals such as red deer. There are also issues about the use of lower density bullets and the chance of ricochet. For example, copper is much lower density than lead and therefore is more likely to ricochet, and there are problems related to that, whereas a higher density bullet is less likely to ricochet. There is nothing in my mind within the financial resolution that's put forward on this. And my view is, whilst I support the principle of moving away from lead shot, I'm not sure we're in a position to do that at the moment. I also find it quite odd that this very small use of lead seems to be being singled out when the use of lead pipes in the delivering of water to many properties across Scotland is still considered acceptable, a much higher risk, in the same way that the use of asbestos pipes, which is used on a huge amount of public water mains across Scotland, especially in the Highlands, there are thousands and thousands of kilometres of asbestos used in water pipes are not being dealt with at the same time. And for these reasons, whilst I support the principle of it, I can't actually support it. I would have to abstain if this was put to a vote. And I hope that I've been clear in the reasons why I've taken that position. I support the principle, but not actually the delivery of it at this stage. And I think that another 3 years on top of the 3 years, or a minimum of 2 years, taking it to 5 years would be far more suitable. Now, Bob, I think you've indicated you want to pass comment.
Yes, Convener. just to put on record what is on page 8 of the briefing that's been prepared for us, which I know says that a voluntary phase-out by 2025 on the use of lead shot that was led by the UK shooting organisation has been shown to be largely ineffective at minimising the use of lead ammunition, and therefore effective regulation is required in this case. It leads me to think that if UK shooting organisations were content to go for a voluntary phase-out, that they must have thought it was a practical thing to do, but that it's not been successful in driving the change they want to see. I would also add that the agency, and this is verbatim from the notes we have in front of us, convener, the agency only considered the restriction where appropriate alternatives were available. Therefore, small calibre bullets, less than 6.17mm for live quarry shooting, have not been included in the restriction, as there was insufficient evidence that viable alternatives were available. So I don't have a background in this, convener, but what I do is a brief has been prepared for us ahead of this committee, which would seem to substantiate this was a reasonable thing to do. And I get that you've got a very bespoke experience in relation to this, convener, but I think it's only fair to put the alternative view or position on the record this morning, given that it's in my briefing papers.
And I think that's absolutely right and fair, and I think the point you make about on small calibre bullets relates to such small calibres as .22, where there is no alternative. But I think most people would accept that 243 becoming a suitable calibre, or remaining as a suitable calibre for red deer, is questionable. You would have to go up to a 270, probably with a 95 to 100 grain bullet as a minimum, because a 243 wouldn't have the effective knockdown capacity. And I certainly take your point, Bob, that mine is from experience of actually doing it, and I'm trying to get that on the record.
Okay. I appreciate that, convener. I would not be intended to try and block the policy intent here, and I appreciate that may mean that we part ways in relation to how we cast a vote, but I'm just wondering, that's not a reason to ignore the individual concerns that you've raised, convener, which we could take up in correspondence with the Scottish Government also, I think.
I appreciate that offer, and I think that raising some of the issues with the Scottish Government may make the implementation of this proposed ban, should it be agreed across the United Kingdom, more easy for lots of people, on the basis that it will affect, of course, the Scottish Government, because the Scottish Government employ stalkers from Forestry Land Scotland, who will have to probably look to change a lot of their rifles and weapons to allow them to carry out the duties that they have to as rangers. I'm looking to see if there's any other comments that want to be made. Sorry, Monica.
Convener, yes, since there's been a sort of fuller discussion, and you've indicated that this will probably result in a vote today, because I think there is division. I welcome the advice and background papers that have been provided to the committee today. What really stands out for me is that the notification outlines the reasons that lead ammunition is being restricted, and that signals to us, impacts not only on wildlife but also on human health as well. In the papers, we're being advised that ingesting lead from ammunition is known to cause excess deaths in wildfowl and poison predatory species that eat contaminated prey or carcasses, also highlighting that humans can be exposed through consuming game meat that has been shot with lead ammunition. So these seem like quite serious matters that we should take into consideration. I've not heard anything that would persuade me not to support this today, but I just thought it would be important to get that on the record.
Thank you. And I guess as a result of shooting some things, I've eaten quite a lot of lead in my time. I seem to be fine on the back of it. Or you may argue that point.
Yeah.
Mr. Stewart, I notice you smile at that stage. So the question, therefore, I'm going to move to a substantive question, having made it. Is the committee content for the provision set out in the notification to be made to the proposed UK statutory instrument? We're not agreed. So we're going to have to go to a vote, and because Michael is online, I'm going to have to do it by roll call. So I'll literally start with Douglas, move round the table, and then move to Michael. So Michael's gone blank. I hope he's still here.
Abstain, convener.
Okay. So you're abstaining. Kevin?
Yes.
Okay. Monica?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Michael?
Yes.
Okay, we got that in between flickers of being on and on Loughlin. So Michael said yes, and I'm abstaining. So I'll just read out the results of that vote. So just so we're clear, there's 4 votes for, there's 2 no votes against, and there's 2 abstentions. Therefore, it is agreed. Is the committee happy that some of the questions that I've raised today regarding issues such as calibers and the financial matters and the alternatives are raised with the Scottish Government so we can get a response? Bob, you want to come back?
Convener, and I say this with complete respect and courtesy, as long as the wording of that letter doesn't recount your comments this morning as the factual position, and it may very well be the factual position, Convener, but we've not taken evidence on this. So if the suggestion has been made that, and then some of the matters that you've drawn to the committee's attention, and we seek a response to that, that would seem to be reasonable. Or just refer the Cabinet Secretary to the official report and ask them to comment on that.
Bob, I think the answer would be I'd let the clerks draft up the letter, and I'd be very happy to share the draft of the letter with Michael once I'm happy with it. But in accordance with the way I generally respond to these things, I will do it without fear or favour to myself to make sure that we've got it right. Kevin.
Thank you, Convener. I'm just wondering if although it's a statutory instrument, I just wonder if the Scottish Government is the right body to write to, because at the end of the day, this is UK legislation.
Kevin, thank you. The clerks have said that the Scottish Government are acceding to this request, so they would be the right person, but it might well be that they have to contact the UK Government to clarify some of the details within it. So we'll follow the procedure and the direction of travel, if you're all right with that, Kevin. Okay, thank you very much. So that's all that we're going to do in public. We're now going to move into private.